Representatives and senators, welcome back.
Thank you, sir.
Hope you enjoyed your lunch. You enjoyed the heat outside. And I think before we get out of here, it may eclipse 100. So already, wow. It makes, yeah, once you go out, then the temperature in here is just fine. All right. We'll continue with juvenile justice as some of our representatives and senators make their way back in. That's Ms. Nunez with the State Advisory Council on Juvenile Justice. You're on deck. Aha.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, sorry to interrupt. Ms. Nunez, if you could use the microphone, the button on the center.
Thank you. This is my first time, so I need direction. Okay, so my name is Norina Nunez, and today I'm here speaking to you as a member of the State Advisory Council on Juvenile Justice. Before I tell you what the council's been doing, let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a professor of psychology at the university, and I came to Wyoming in 1987, which dates myself. Since that time, I have been teaching adolescent development at the university at least once a year, sometimes twice a year for the past 34 years. So even though I'll be representing the State Advisory Council today, if the committee has any questions about adolescent development or adolescent brain development, I'd be happy to try to answer them for you. And if I can't answer it, I'll try to get you the information. So let me tell you a little bit about the council. So this is our webpage. The State Advisory Council was established by statute. And our website, I can't see it from here, but it's wyjuvenilejustice.com. Okay. It was established by statute. It requires that there are at least 15 members on the council at all times, and they have to represent each judicial district in the state of Wyoming. They're appointed by the governor, and they're advisory to the governor. So we are advisory to the governor. We are also advisory to the joint judiciary, according to statute. Originally, I believe the statute read that we were advisory to the legislature. That was changed at some later point in time, I think 2013, to say joint judiciary. Okay. The statute says that we have to meet 4 times a year. We actually meet 5. And before the pandemic, what we do is we meet in a different community around the state each time. And we try to get to know each community, what their issues are, what they're dealing with. Believe it or not, our first face-to-face meeting is happening this Thursday and Friday in Afton. And Afton is a community we hadn't been able to go to. So we try to get to know the entire state. So if you look at our membership, this is the membership that is currently on the website. You see which judicial district each person represents. And if you click 5 times, you'll see some little arrows. This is the executive committee on the council. And the only reason I'm pointing them out is I've asked the LSO to send this PowerPoint presentation to all of you, and I have our contact information. So if you have any questions, please feel free to contact the council's advisory committee. Danielle? One more? Okay, so here we are. Brandon Schimmelfenig works for Department of Family Services, but he is the liaison for the council. The council works in close collaboration with DFS. And so Brandon is our liaison. And then there are the 5 committee members. Feel free to contact us or somebody in your district that you know. Given our statutory charge, I want to point out also that every single one of the members of the council are interested in youth in some way, work with youth. In the membership, which we passed by, Gary Gilmore, who's the director of the boys' school, is part of our council. So is Chris Jones, who's part of our council. We have Cathedral Home in Laramie. So all of these people have expertise in juvenile justice. And so given our charge to be advisory to both the governor and you, what we'd like to do is offer our expertise to you as you study the juvenile justice system. We would like to offer our expertise on anything. please ask us. We have been in many communities. We know, we work closely with many communities around the state. We also know a little bit about their prevention programs. We know a lot about their diversion programs and how they differ. So feel free to ask us anything and we'll try to get information back to you. And we also have some data, and if you are looking for data, which it seems that you are, please feel free to ask us and we'll try to get anything back to you that you need. Part of our statutory job is to help you.
So on that note, I think you've heard some of the requests today. So I don't know if you've been taking a list, or I guess you could go back and listen to
Yeah.
the feed, but rather than re-ask it, I would say that the data that we're looking for, to the extent that you have access to any of that data, we would love to have it. It's particularly, we're just simply looking at the number of juveniles who are brought before the system, period. So they're charged with something, and then where do they end up? How do they end up there? Are they ending up in the right place? That's all we're trying to figure out. So it sounds like you may have some of the frontline data.
Chair Olson, I do have some slides that I can share with you that I think will answer some of the questions that
Oh,
you had this
perfect.
morning. Okay, so
Okay.
hopefully, okay. So next slide. The council was established in 1997 by the legislature and Governor Geringer. And I was on that first council in 1997. So I've been a council member. I've served both terms of Governor Meade, both terms of Governor Geringer, and now Governor Gordon. I didn't serve during the Friedenthal years only because I was busy. But when Governor Meade was elected, I was asked to return by one of his people in his office. So in 1997, we looked around and we said, well, what are we going to do? We need to know how many juveniles are in the system. What happens to them? Where do they go? And the answer was, we don't know. So in 1997 was the first time we learned that we don't know, that we have no data collection. So the questions that you're asking today as a committee, we asked in 1997, okay? So the council has been working very hard through the years to try to get the answers to that question. Our annual report in 2006, I'm not going to bore you by taking you back to the annual reports of 1997, but in our annual report of 2006 to the governor, it says, one of our recommendations is to improve data collection, reporting, and information sharing. The data is needed to show what steps are being accomplished in Wyoming. From the 2013 report, continue to support the development of a unified statewide data collection for Wyoming juveniles that will track points of contact with the juvenile justice system from initial contact through court action. We have put that recommendation in our reports every single year. Now, in 2011, Governor Meade was elected, and he was keen on using data to inform decisions. And one of his first tasks to the council was to develop and advise him as to what kind of data needed to be collected in the state of Wyoming, and to make some recommendations to him about that data collection. What do we need? Okay, what are the basics that we need? So in 2015, we had been advising Governor Meade about what data needed to be collected. It was very basic. We didn't want to start out by saying we need recidivism and program evaluation. We said, well, we need some basic questions answered. We want some demographic data. We want to know what ages the kids are. We want to know ethnicity. We want some basic information. We want to know what kinds of crimes or what kinds of trouble kids were getting into, what courts they went into, and then what was the disposition. Were they detained? Were they let go? What happened to them? So in 2015, Governor Meade, I think, made some of the legislators angry by allocating a line item in the budget, $50,000 to DFS. And he tasked DFS to work with the SAC-JJ to develop a data collection system for Wyoming. So this was the point at which we finally had some impetus. And so if you can click forward, in 2017, ROM was born. Now, you've heard this word ROM today, and it stands for something, and it stands for something meaningful, but I can't tell you what that is, okay? ROM, it is a data collection system. So what happened was,
Now that's gonna bother me for the rest of the day, wanting to know what ROM means.
does anybody know?
Nobody knows. Okay, please proceed.
So what was happening is at the time, the director of DFS was Director Corsi, Dr. Corsi. He was working with the University of Kansas to collect some data that DFS was interested in. And it was mostly child welfare data and outcomes that he was looking at. But he took part of the money that was allocated by Governor Meade and used that with us to develop a little juvenile justice add-on piece. I think Director Schmidt mentioned adding on to existing pieces. They added on to the ROM system, and there is a small juvenile justice piece that we started collecting. It's very simple data. It's not fancy, but it's very basic. And what we did was when we got ROM started, we tied the ROM data collection to the CJSB funding. In other words, if you got money for your CJSB, you had to collect data. So we had like a little carrot and a stick. Here's your money, we need data. So in answer to Chair Olson's question about data, you know that what I'm going to be showing you is the data from 14 counties, not a statewide picture. So it's better than nothing, but it's not the whole picture. So in 2018, the SAC-JJ entered into a memorandum of understanding with DFS to take over the data collection. So DFS is still helping us. Brandon Schimmelfenig enters the data, but we really are the ones responsible for collecting the data. And it's kind of an unusual situation because we're an all voluntary group. We all have day jobs. And so any failings of the data from this 2018 forward is because we just don't have enough time and manpower to make sure it's really good, okay? But I'm going to try to share with you what we have, and I just want you to keep in mind that there are some problems with it, and I'll point that out. So if you could show the next slide. And so as you know, the CJSBs were established statutorily, and then the legislature then gave the funding. We know this. The interesting thing about this is that the CJSBs were established statutorily before the funding. And there are not very many communities established CJSBs, but as soon as you attach funding to it, all of a sudden 15 communities popped up. We now have 14. So 14 communities have been participating. And if you hit this again, we have been collecting data from these counties on a quarterly basis. They send us that basic information every quarter of every single child that goes through single point of entry. Okay, so we have that number for 14 counties. In 2017 and 2019, one of the problems that we had, again, going back to a little bit of history, I told you that Governor Meade gave us $50,000, well, not us, but to establish this data. One of our goals was to get this data system together and then go out and train the communities, the single point of entry people, how to enter the data. What does diversion mean? What does detention mean? To try to get us all on the same page to get good data. Unfortunately, some of that $50,000 just went someplace into the ether, as it often happens. And so we never had the money to actually train the communities. So in 2017, 2019, Adrian Frang, who's on the SACJJ, and Craig Fiscus, who's at Volunteers of America, they started working with communities on making this data better, because some people were putting things into one category. We had diversion, diversion light, diversion plus, and we had to try to figure out what they were talking about, because we have to be talking the same page. So having said that, let me show you some of the data, okay? Okay, next slide. Okay, the word statewide comes from the website. I just want you to keep in mind, this is not statewide data, but this is 14 counties in the state. So if you see, look there, in answer, Chair Olson, to one of your questions, at least in 14 counties, a little under 2,000 youth in our state went through single point of entry. That is that number there. I'm using 2019 because, as you all know, 2020 data is quirky, and we also want to forget 2020 as much as we can. So if you look at that And by the way, there are limitations to the way this data is presented. It's a stacked graph, making it really kind of hard to look at. But for a moment, let me try to help you figure this out. So down on the bottom, that blue is diversion. And there's about 100 kids in that diversion bar. By the way, this is not how I would do a graph, but I don't have any control over how. Ron
Yeah, there's
does it.
2 light blues.
Yes, yes, it's a very confusing way to do things, and at least a dozen different oranges and yellows, which if you're colorblind, you're going to have a hard time. But I worked through the numbers, and about 100 kids in 2019 in those 14 counties went through diversion. About the same number, 100 were detained, either through detention or juvenile commitment. And again, some counties, the way they define this is a little quirky. So it could be more than 100 because they may be putting some of that into the other category. But it gives you a little bit of a picture, a place to start. The truth is, I think this is accurate in the sense that there was about 2,000 kids that went through single point of entry in those 14 counties. I think that's probably very, very accurate if you wanted to get a number.
Well, you would have the data that went into making this graph. You could
Correct.
just provide us with that data.
We have de-identified data. So
Okay.
we don't have the actual case information, but I can go through, like, for example, that color that says other disposition that looks like it's a light blue, it's actually green. So the computer screen is showing it a little bit differently. If you look at some of the other dispositions, you see that there is some confusion. Sometimes when a child gets both probation and a fine, they don't know which category to put it in, so they put it into the other. And we've been working with counties to try to get this cleaner. We have been working very hard to make this data better and better and better, but it does have some information. So for example, I understand that you folks in the legislature this past year, we're talking about fines. And so if you look at the fines section, there were about, what was it, about 600 kids, I figured, that had gotten some kind of fine. So I went through the data a little bit more. If you could go to the next one. Just to look at where the fines are, just again, just as an idea of what the data can tell you. You can see that when kids commit crimes against persons, very few of those kids get a fine as a disposition. And by the way, I looked at the data, and most of the crimes against persons are fighting. There are very few assault charges or anything so serious, but there's a lot of fighting in this category. About a little over 210 kids were cited for a crime against persons during 2019. And you can see that very few of those kids got a fine. Try the next one, which is status offenses. And you'll see right here, that's where the fines sit, is in those status offenses. And when I look at the data to see what kinds of status offenses they commit, it's overwhelmingly tobacco offenses, overwhelmingly. So if the legislature or if the joint judiciary was interested in looking at fines, this data can kind of help you figure out, maybe we should look at what we're charging for traffic offenses. And I'm just using that as an example, but we have other things that we could help you with. We could tell you about, no surprise, the data set is mostly boys, fewer girls. We could give you some information about the demographics, ethnicity, things like that, types of crimes, what courts they go through. That was a question I believe was asked earlier this morning. We do have some of this data. It's not perfect, but it's a start. Okay, you could go to the next one.
Can I ask a question with the fines? Would that also include they may have received a fine and been put into a placement somewhere? Or is that telling us that was the only penalty?
Chair, it would have been only fines, because what I found is the communities, when they give two kind of outcomes, they typically put it in other. This is something that we're working on trying to fix, to have them put it into the most severe category. But that has been a problem with our data. So if you want to show the next point, in 2019 and 2020, we modified the spreadsheets to make the data collection easier. Volunteers of America has a grant that some communities get for juvenile justice stuff, and we had the CJSB money. We both required some kind of data collection. Most of it was overlap, but then we wanted specific data, and the counties were saying, this is crazy. We're collecting 2 different spreadsheets and you're driving us crazy. So what we did was we worked on making the spreadsheet just one and making their data collection easier. We also held 3 statewide trainings for communities across the state. The first one was just an introductory get together. Tell us about your issues, your juvenile justice system. The second training was on how to use the new spreadsheets. And by the way, they were pretty well attended. We got Teton County, Natrona County, Uinta, Campbell, Albany, Sweetwater. We got a bunch of them to attend these trainings. And the last training was on how to use data to get grants. And then the last thing that happened in 2020 was reaching out to the Wyoming Survey and Analysis Center, which is an independent research center at the University of Wyoming. They got a grant to evaluate diversion programs. And I think you all heard this morning about diversion. Diversion means something different depending on where you live. In some communities, there are things like they do Alive at 25, which is for traffic citations. Others have mentor programs. Some programs require UAs, weekly urine analysis. Some do not, so forth and so on. And YSAC got a grant to evaluate diversion. And so we've been partnering with them. And Sweetwater County was ready to evaluate their diversion program. They were heads and shoulders above some of the other communities in terms of their data collection. And so they've been working with YSAC to evaluate whether or not diversion really does work. And then YSAC just applied for another grant, and they were going to start looking at the pieces of diversion that make things successful or not. So across the state, if you require UAs for kids, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is it good to do it once a month, once a week? The pieces of diversion that work and the pieces of diversion that don't work, we were getting ready to do. But then of course, you know what happened. The 2020 budget cuts put the brakes on our momentum. The defunding of the CJSBs has really hurt us. The last point, some of the communities are not going to be able to continue their programs. Sweetwater just contacted us and they said that their diversion program is in jeopardy and they were going to pull out of the YSAC thing because they weren't going to be doing it. We also don't have any leverage to have communities continue to give us data. I happen to know Brandon Schimmelton, they just emailed me today saying that Crook County and Teton County are not going to be providing data anymore. And this is just the start. So now we'll be down to 12 counties. There's just no leverage for us to say, you need to keep giving us your data. The small baby steps that we've taken are maybe lost. And we also may be losing the diversion programs. We're just getting ready to evaluate whether diversion works. And there are lots of communities that are pulling out because they said, we don't think we're going to have diversion anymore. So last slide. So I just want to end by telling you what we've learned so that you all don't make the same mistake if you decide to go down the data road. First of all, I keep telling you our data is not statewide. And if you want to know what's happening in Bighorn County, for example, they're not participating. So I can't tell you what's happening in Park, or we're missing some big chunks. Another thing, we spent so much time trying to get the data, get the quality data that we wanted, because we didn't train the communities up front. And I think Director Schmidt mentioned something like that. The data collection can be good on the back end, but if it's not good on the front end, the people entering it need to understand what the data collection is. We put the cart before the horse, and then we always had to go back and say, oh, our data is not working. We need to train communities. So training communities to do it. And have professionals manage the data. I would hold the SAC-JJ up as not the professionals. We're doing the best we can, but we've made a lot of mistakes. So an example of a professional might be what Director Schmidt talked about, that data system, or the Survey Analysis Center. And then finally, I just want to say that as you go along, if you have any questions about what data should be collected, please ask us. We've been dealing with this since 1997 for 24 years. We might have some suggestions, and we might also be able to tell you what doesn't work because we've made many, 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 many mistakes. And finally, I just want to say thank you all for looking into this topic. I've waited 24 years for this to happen, and I commend you all for whatever you do. So thank you. And do you have any questions?
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ms. Nunez, for being here. I have a few questions, if that's okay. The first one is, to your knowledge, what are the reasons that you hear from counties as to why they don't accept the block grant funding for the justice boards?
Chair and Representative Rodriguez-Williams, it's very simple. If you look at the counties that are not taking the grant, they tend to be quite small counties: Bighorn, Hot Springs, Goshen, Niobrara. And the amount of money that they would get was so small because there was a formula. The amount of money that they would get was so small, they didn't feel that it would add anything to their programs.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My second question is to your knowledge, have any agencies within the state of Wyoming evaluated the effectiveness of programs that are used in various different settings? I know there's a wealth of programs out there in the OJJDP model programs guide, and I'm curious if these programs are looked at every so often, and whether or not some agencies decide whether or not it's time to shift gears and maybe try a different program.
It's a great question, Chair and Representative Rodriguez-Williams. The answer to the question is that no, there has not been a program evaluation. There are many reasons for that. One of the reasons is it costs a lot of money. I think the second more important reason is the lack of expertise. I know that Adrian Frang and myself, we have been helping. We both have PhDs, we both know research, we both know the science of program evaluation, and we can do that. And we have been helping counties to evaluate small pieces, but nothing at the level that would get that kind of science-based efficacy data. What we were really hoping to do with the diversion data with WISAC, we were hoping to get that level of data. We were hoping to do a really precise scientific study of diversion that could be publishable, that would meet that high bar, and then we could actually talk about diversion in a science-based way. But no, we haven't been able to do that yet.
Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Last question. I'm familiar with the Wyoming Association of Sheriffs and Chiefs of Police juvenile data that they have. And I'm just curious how that compares to the data you've collected in a sense of some of the higher rate categories like juvenile DUIs.
So Chair and Representative Rodriguez-Williams, I'd like to say that I don't know what data the Chiefs, Sheriffs and Chiefs Association is collecting. I do know that when we first started looking for data, we went to a lot of places. The statute points to DCI, right? And I think that was mentioned this morning. We went to DCI and we said, what data do you have? And they said, we don't have data. The other place that got pointed to was the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court also said it didn't have the data. So I'm not too sure what they have, but we have asked almost everybody in the state. So I'm not too sure how ours is different. So I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Zwanitzer.
Thanks. Just a quick question, Mr. Chairman. On the 14 counties, I guess my question is, are they the 14 most populous counties that have services? So we can draw some inference of their 80% of the population, or I just want to double check on those 14 if they're the most populous that would normally be the bulk of Wyoming to begin with.
Yeah, so Chair and Representative Zwanitzer, We did discuss that. If we looked at the population centers, the population of each of these counties that are participating, and we figured that we are capturing close to 70% of the entire population of Wyoming. But because there are regional differences, well, this is the science talking to me, it's not a random sample. So are there differences, for example, in Park County that would really change the data? I can't answer that question, but I do feel comfortable that we're capturing the major population centers.
I definitely think there's a little bit of difference in Park County versus Laramie County. Generally, no. They still have dance. Yep.
And maybe a broader question. So as part of this council, are there areas of statutory concern that this committee can directly work on that keep coming up over and over, or place, that you would point us towards to say, this part of the system is really where 80% of the issues keep coming to the forefront, where we keep having funding problems, infrastructure issues? Give us any direction you could provide.
Stole my question.
Great minds think alike.
Well, thank you, Chair and Representatives Zwanesser. That's something we've been talking about a lot. We don't talk typically about statutory changes because we're sort of a policy advisory council and we've never been asked to comment on statute. I believe that one of the things that we have looked at is the statute that put us into place. And we find that in some instances, some of the things that we're supposed to do we've never been asked to do. So in some ways, we're not following statute to the letter because no one has ever asked us to. I think the idea of looking at the juvenile justice system and can we do this better, I think it's a wonderful thing to do. States around us have done it and are doing better for their kids and saving lots of money.
It sounds like, it sounds like maybe your advisory council went a while without necessarily a home committee to follow up on. So maybe that's why some of those statutory, guidelines or requirements maybe fell through the cracks, is that it sounds like they put you out there, here's the block grant, now go do things. And then there was never any follow-up until.
And Chair Olson, you're absolutely correct. And I think it makes a huge difference as to who's our governor. It's not to say that any of our governors have not been interested. They all have, but their priorities are sometimes a little bit different. I've noticed just over the years, and even the legislature.
Sure.
We've always statutorily, we're supposed to report to you, but no one has ever asked us for information. So maybe you didn't even know we existed. So, but we're here, and if you're interested in juvenile justice issues, we'd be happy to help in any way we can.
Co-chairman Nethercutt.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Thanks for being here and your candid answers here. So do you think that the program should continue or should it be eliminated and some of the mission of the organization of the entity should be directed somewhere else?
Chair Nethercutt, are you asking about the council?
Yes.
I will honestly tell you that the council is probably the best thing that I've ever participated in, even though we feel like we're walking in baby steps. And it's taken 24 years for us to come up with a sort of halfway data system that's sort of okay. That's maybe not fast enough for some people, but it's so much better than it was. So I feel like our council is nonpartisan. We're half Republicans, half Democrats. We don't know who's what because we don't care. We just all care about kids, and we come from all over the state and we work very hard together. So, by the way, we are federally funded too. So we don't take any state dollars.
It would make that council really turn the gears, legislative appointees. I noticed there's no legislative liaisons, which is another issue on why there's a disconnect in communication between what's happening in the legislature.
Chair Olson, we used to have legislative appointees, and Senator Christensen used to attend regularly.
Okay.
Leland.
Yep.
Yes, okay. Attended regularly and was a very active member of our council, was a wonderful person to have. We have judges, Donessa Snyder from, from Rollins. We have a city council member from Fremont. So we do want elected officials to join us if anybody was interested.
Now, who
I know you
became the
have a
chairman
lot on your
after
plates.
Leland Christensen. Yes. Sure.
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Nunez, looking at your 2020 council recommendations, specifically number 3, the recommendation states that there's a significant increase in children with mental health issues coming into care and into the juvenile justice system in our state. And your recommendation states that funding for mental health treatment services remain intact and not reduced. Since this recommendation's been presented, I assume, to the governor, has there been any funding allocated through COVID dollars, or is there any discussion about future monies
Chair
for
Olson
that?
and Representative Rodriguez Williams, no, there has been no recommendation. It is a growing problem in our state. We go from county to county to have our meetings. And one of the things we always ask is, what is your biggest problem? For a long time, it was meth. Meth was a big problem. But now almost all of them tell us they have no place for kids who are getting into trouble, who have mental health issues. They don't have there are no placements, and they don't have anything in the community either that will help these kids. And these kids are at high risk for escalating offending. So there has been no funding dollars.
I have to confess now that we figured out who the Senate appointee is, and now I recall that I was the House appointee 2 years ago. But I just don't remember any official notices, so maybe, but I don't know that our senator necessarily knows that does he?
Our Senator, Senator Dave Kinski, who's a former member of this committee and now on the Appropriations Committee. You're familiar with Senator Kinski? That's good. No.
Well, see, he's not at your meetings either. I wonder if there's a
disconnect.
There's a disconnect, because I now remember being appointed, but I don't remember any meetings. I just assumed nothing was happening.
Well, Chair Olson will make sure to find out who our legislative liaison is, and we will make sure to invite him or her to every single one of our meetings, I promise. From this
And I'll have to
point
make up for all those lost meetings. Okay,
So, Mr. Coachman.
go ahead.
Thank you. So kind of getting back to the candidate assessment, this isn't the purpose of our interim topic here, but there is an entity that's been in existence for 24 years that was statutorily tasked and has funding, federal funding, to create a data collection point. And we have a baby step in that direction. We cannot wait another 24 years. And so we're going to have to come up with a different strategy. And so I would encourage you and all of the stakeholders who find this a very valuable organization. And I agree that it probably is good to get together and have meetings and discuss juvenile justice, but measurable outcomes, as we've heard this morning, is going to be key to that. So I think we need to probably follow up and understand whether or not that's appropriate mission for the council.
And Chair Nethercott, we have other committees that work on other kinds of issues as well. So one of the parts of statute is to gather up, what services are available in the state. And we've been doing that pretty religiously for 24 years. So that if anybody is looking for something, we have, tell me what town you're in. We can tell you what you have in that direction. So that's one of the other things we have to do.
So trying to bring this into some action items, I'm hearing that, obviously the data is what we're searching for. The data is not statewide, but the data that is reported to your organization is based on whether they participate in the block grant or not.
Mhm.
But the reason why some communities may have chosen not to participate in the block grant is because it just wasn't a big enough grant to begin with.
And yes, Chair, and now that the money is gone, they're pulling out too.
And so, yeah, and that's number two, beyond having the data, the apparent line item budget disappearance does sound like it's becoming problematic. And then I'm going back to the data repository question that I asked Corin, because I didn't realize you're kind of an intermediary. You're receiving that data that we're looking for from the 14 counties, but you could theoretically be receiving it from all. I mean, that's a statutory fix. So the legislature could simply mandate that that be provided. It could also provide a block grant with a little bit of an incentive to provide the data. But it sounds like if there's not a sunset on your council in the statute, so it would continue to exist if there were a block grant.
Chair, and I guess maybe to clarify a little bit, I think the reason why we were put into place was not necessarily to find data, but rather, I don't know if you realize that Wyoming is a non-participating state. We do not participate in the OJJDP Act. And so because of that, we are entitled to a certain amount of money as a non-participating state to have a state council that works to better juvenile justice in light of the fact that we're not participating. So that our money comes from OJJDP to form this council. So that I think, although this council was formed in 1997, I think the impetus was not necessarily from the legislature, but from this money being available to Wyoming to look at juvenile justice.
But your slide on lessons from ROM, going back to Representative Swanser's question of, what could we do statutorily? I think that's what your recommendations would be. You're saying data collection, train communities, and have professionals manage, synthesize, analyze the data.
Yes, sir. And there are people like myself, and I mentioned Adrian Frang, who have PhDs and do research. We're happy to analyze data, but you do need professionals to sort of train communities and get the whole data set up.
Co-Chairman Nethercott.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. And how do you train communities on setting up juvenile justice programs?
Well, Chair Nethercott, we don't train them in setting up the programs. We train them on how to use the data. So for example, I told you we're going to Afton Thursday. Well, I'm going to Evanston. Before I go to Afton, I'm working with Uinta County we're looking at their data. I found some little problems. We're going to talk about how they enter when you have this situation. What should you call it? Should you call this probation or detention? And how do you define things? So I'm going to be working with them at the county attorney's office with getting that data clean and nice so that we all understand what we're supposed to put in there. They're the ones that develop the programs, and we're just trying to help them put the data in correctly so that we can evaluate their programs.
Representative Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You probably already said this, but I don't know if I caught it. The dollars that are coming from the federal program, how much are those and how are they dispersed? Is it evenly or just to the ones that request?
Great question, Chair and Representative Larson. The money is, I believe, I don't want to swear on it. I believe it's about $25,000 per year. It's not a lot of money. This is money for the council to meet. So the statute says we have to meet 4 times a year, and I believe that's part of the federal requirement as well. And the federal requirement is that we have to have representatives from each of the judicial districts. So the money that we get is really for the council to meet and to host our website and things like that, and to drive up to testify at a joint judiciary, that kind of thing. It's not for programming.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. And Dr. Nunez, this question is entirely different from where we've been going. But given that you are a professor and PhD in psychology, and we talked about fines for some of these status offenses, and that being a bulk of those punishments, are those fines an effective form of punishment to stop smoking or delinquent behavior? Is that strategy working based in evidence?
No, Chair and Representative Ravenza. No, the reason why is because the fines fall on the parents of the children. So they're the ones that end up paying the fines. The outcome is not tied to the child. The child needs to have an outcome, not the parent. And as you may know, some of these parents are not, the reason why they're having so many problems is their parenting is not great. I know that if my father had to have paid $60 for smoking a cigarette, I would never have smoked a cigarette again because he would have made sure. But for many of these kids, there isn't anything in the family that will be tied to that. So no, it doesn't work.
Co-Chairman Nethercutt.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Ms. Nunez, you were here this morning and you heard some of the information from the Council of State Governments, or CSG, with the potential opportunity of them coming into Wyoming and kind of unpacking all of our data for us. Do you think that that would be a useful effort?
Madam Chair, yes, I do. I was very excited listening to this.
Do you think that we could utilize some of that $25,000 of federal funds? Who's your statutory mission to get that accomplished to help pay for that?
Madam Chair, I think we could. I just don't think it would even touch the surface of what it would cost to do something like what they were proposing today.
How much money do you think that the council could provide for the effort?
I can't speak for the council, but I can say that we could provide some money, but I'm pretty sure that the amount that we would tell you wouldn't be anything that would even remotely cover what needs to be covered. But I know that our council would probably be all in favor of something like this.
We could just redirect these juvenile fines to fund our study. Senator Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Nez, in the 24 years you've been gathering information, bless you for doing that. I'm sure it's a wealth of information, but what's actually been done with it?
Well, so we, Chair and Senator Cooper, sorry, I always forget the protocol here. We have not been collecting data for very long. We started collecting around 2015, but one thing I would say that I have seen in the state, there has been a tremendous change. I don't want to be the Debbie Downer at this meeting who says that for 24 years we haven't done anything. Diversion grew up during my 24 years. When I first started, there were very few diversion programs, and now there are, almost every community has a diversion program, and that's an exciting thing. And more people are talking about mental health. I think it's true that we have a crisis in terms of mental health problems among kids, but I don't want to say that there weren't mental health problems in the children in 1997. There were huge unmet needs there, but now we're talking about it and recognizing it. So I feel like we have made tremendous progress. We just don't know because we're not collecting the data.
Got a follow-up, Senator?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. In the last 6 years, the data you showed us a little bit ago, were you able to draw a consensus from it? And was there a pattern across the 14 counties that you have? The smaller counties, we talked here just a minute ago about mandating something, but we were talking about mandates without funding. That doesn't work. We've got these smaller counties. The reason they're not reporting because they just simply don't have the personnel to do it. They have a one-person office or maybe a two-person office. They don't have a staff. So the 14 communities that you had, was there a pattern that was followed across there?
Chair and Senator Cooper, yes, it is true that the smaller counties are not the ones that are typically participating. I and some of the SAC JJ members have been working with Goshen County, who is not participating. They really want to do something good, but you're right, they have one person, and we asked about some data, and it took them a very long time because they actually physically went through files and pulled that data up, and that person has another whole job to do. So they're well-meaning people in small communities that don't have the resources to do what we're asking them to do, but they want to.
Yeah, and I think that's a reality that we have to wrestle with. I'm going to push back a little bit on the unfunded mandate comment. The reality is that we, the state of Wyoming, have a direct distribution to local governments. Every budget that goes into the general funds of the counties. It's not earmarked. It doesn't go anywhere. So the state of Wyoming sends back sales tax dollars that are redistributed from all over the state to local governments. And we expect that they would do something, in return. And it certainly wouldn't be unfunded if the reality is that we're spending more dollars in unwise ways in our juvenile system. It would be wise to invest in some way to understand that data. And part of the overworked reality of juveniles coming into, it exists in the system because of possibly the recidivism rate. That's the reality, is that if the prosecutors and the judges and the justice system at the front of the doors has 2,000 individuals, and only less than 25% of those were diverted or whatever percentage, then if we can do something to positively impact that recidivism rate, then it would be worth their time to report the data. I'm not necessarily suggesting that we just mandate it, but I was being facetious that this legislature, if they believe that this is something that's important, as prior governors had endeavored down this road, then we have to put our money where our mouth is and figure out how to fund it.
And Chair Olson, it's true. And there are counties, like I said, I'm going to Uinta County Wednesday and working with them, and they are losing CJSB money just like everybody else, but they still want to learn how to do it better. It's not just the money, but the money helps. So they do have some people, a little bit of extra people that they're very interested, and I'm going to still help them get better data, even though their CJSB money is gone.
And to Senator Nethercott's question about the $25,000 that's federally allocated for your council, I would assume that is that reimbursed, or so it's after expenses.
Chair Olson, it goes through DFS, and it's in a budget for us. And just to Chair Nethercott's question, I'm guessing, and I don't think I'm wrong here, but we didn't ask them this morning. I'm guessing that the kind of study that they were proposing for the state of Wyoming would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. So, okay. We'd have to not meet for how many years before we could get that money together. So.
No, I don't think that would necessarily pay for it, but I mean.
But it would accomplish your statutory vision.
Chair Nethercott, I know I can't speak for the council. We are meeting Thursday, we could vote, but it is true that because of COVID, we could not meet for 1 year. We do have a little extra money that we were wondering what to do with it. So this is being recorded, and now I have to go to my counsel and tell them that I offered up money when I went to the joint judiciary, and now I'm in real trouble. But it is true, Senator Nethercott, that it's possible we may have a small pittance to throw at that project if you find it worthy.
Co-Chairman Olson can maybe attend the meetings to make up for last meetings.
I need to make up for those meetings.
And to the committee and the chairs, we are still doing it on Zoom as well, if anybody wanted to join for a few minutes. We have youth members that we are required to have youth members. Youth being defined as anyone under 26, which is a youth to me. But we do have youth members. They don't usually stay long because our meetings are rather long and dull, but I think you're used to this.
Let me ask this, are there other federal grant opportunities available that it's just how we've defined the mission statement of the council that because of its composition that we don't apply for those for other federal funds?
Chair Olson, we would not be eligible to apply for grants because of the entity that we are, but
Or,
we
well,
are.
DFS, I mean.
We are working also with counties to try to get them to apply for grant money. That was one of the trainings that we did, realizing that the money was drying up in Wyoming and trying to help counties get their own money, chase their own money. But again, what will end up happening, to Senator Cooper's comment, the smaller counties will probably lose out on a chase like this. Bigger counties with more that have grant writers, that have data. In order to get a grant, you have to have data. If you don't have data, you're not going to get a grant. So what will end up happening is we'll have an unequal system in the state of Wyoming with the larger counties having resources and the smaller counties not.
What you just said is exactly the issue in the state of Wyoming with every service that we provide in larger communities that are able to have mental health, substance abuse treatment. Smaller counties can't. And I think as a legislature, at some point, we have to come to the reality that the cost to provide services in a rural state like the state of Wyoming and to provide them equitably to smaller counties and smaller communities means that we
More
have
money.
to figure out a way to step that up and spread those resources in a better way, because what you said is the reality. That's why they're not applying for the block grant. And so they probably have, they probably have higher recidivism than they'd otherwise like among those juveniles. Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. It's my understanding that the state of Wyoming has federal dollars or funding on the table because we don't participate in the juvenile the OJJDP, I believe. Can you speak to that as to why we're not getting those funds or what that would look like and what that means for other states that do get it?
So yes, we do not participate because we do not meet the 4 core requirements for OJJDP. It's one of those things that has happened. We've never participated, but I don't see this as a really bad thing. The core requirements are great. They're wonderful. We should strive towards them, but because we're a rural state, it's very hard to meet those requirements. So we don't participate and we don't lose that money, okay? What happens is the money that would have come to the state of Wyoming as part of its participation, it would have come directly to the state coffers. Instead, what happens is Volunteers of America applies for a grant for the non-participating money. That is the VOA grant that I told you about. And then communities can apply for this money. So the money that's allocated to the state of Wyoming still comes to the state of Wyoming. It just doesn't come to the legislature. It comes to a nonprofit organization that then divvies up the money. So we don't lose money by not participating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is there oversight of that nonprofit and their operation?
Chair and Representative Provenza, yes. VOA puts out reports every year. They report to us as well. So we get their reports as well. Also, VOA has a grants committee that looks at the grants that come in from communities. And the State Advisory Council has representation on the grants committee. And so we are able to see what the community is planning, how they're going to evaluate, whether it's working, things like that.
So is there a place where you can go to see what the counties are getting or they have asked for the money, or? I guess is my question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair Olson and Representative Larson, I believe there is. And again, this is not my organization. This is Volunteers of America that has this grant. But they also come to every single one of our council meetings. And if the committee would like that information, I'd be happy to talk with VOA and get that information. They are required to report to the feds. They keep a lot of data about the non-participating state money. So we could get that to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in not participating in that money goes to that other entity, is it the same amount of money that the state would get? And if the state got the money, would it go towards paying for the juvenile services on the ground?
Yeah, Chair and Representative Provenza, if we were participating, the money would come to the state and the state would be able to decide how they wanted to use that money. And just so long as we were following the core protections for OJJDP, we would get that money. I want to point out that up until recently, Wyoming was the only state that was not participating. But since then, a couple of other states have decided not to participate. And I can't tell you why they've decided not to, but for a while, we were the only state, but other states are now joining us.
Thank you, Co-Chair Olson. First, God bless you, ma'am, for all the work you put in for all these years. I would like to know, I didn't get the number on the budget that you currently have allocated from using state funds. Like say at 19, I don't know what, say 19 back if you know.
Representative Olson and Senator Kolb, you mean the numbers of kids who went through the single point of entry? Is that the number you're looking for?
No, I'm looking for the amount of money that your board receives in order to do what they're doing.
It's $25,000 a year and it comes from the OJJDP. There is no state money. We have no state money.
Thank you. And do you know what year you were formed in again?
1997.
Do you know what in 2006, there was a bill, I have it here in front of me, that in this committee actually, that actually was House Bill number 82. And it was to form the Joint Judiciary Intercommittee, but let me think, I'll read this, the Juvenile Justice Task Force. And does that have anything to do with you?
No, sir, I don't think so.
Okay, well, thank you for that clarification. It seems like listening to what your testimony's been, that you're frankly underfunded for the amount of data that we need. And this is what you'd heard earlier today, that we don't have the information that we could have had, I guess, if we maybe had a different model we were working with.
Yeah.
So do you think that some mechanism here we need that would help us in getting this data that we have to make a decision?
Yes, Chair and Senator Kolb, absolutely. We're a voluntary board. We don't have any business having this data. We just didn't have anybody that would adopt it. And DFS has been helping us tremendously, but really no one was really interested, so we took it up. But my recommendation, it should be a group, an entity, professionals, a statewide kind of thing that happens, not a group of volunteers in the state.
Well, thank you for your opinion, Mr. Chair.
Thank you.
Very insightful. We do have that presentation. And I think I asked this question about the data point real quick. I asked this question on whether it's possible to supply the data that's in your PowerPoint just in numbers, not in a graph. Is that a possibility?
Chair, I could probably get you those numbers as well, but yeah, I don't know how helpful they will be, but I certainly could. In order to work through the spreadsheets, you'd have to know how to massage data and so forth and so on, but I could certainly get you the spreadsheets if that's of interest to the committee.
Well, I think just in looking at that, PowerPoint, it says that there's 2,000 juveniles who entered the system in those 14 counties. And that you testified that the 14 counties are probably representative because they are the larger population centers within the state. So it seems like if we just knew the breakdown of each of those categories, you know, there were, I don't know, 10 categories on that graph, it would just be the category and the number.
Sure, I would be more than
Maybe.
happy to provide you the frequencies.
Okay.
And even some cross tabs I think we can do. So for example, if you wanted to know what the crimes were committed and the dispositions, we could certainly get you some tables, any kind of table you need like that. I'd be more than happy to provide it.
I think it would be very helpful on the fines specifically,
To know.
because that is a point of interest that the committee obviously is looking at, following up on legislation from the last session on whether those fines serve an appropriate mechanism in our justice system. So that would be helpful. And there's obviously no rush.
Okay.
I don't think our next meeting is until August or September. So
Chair Olson, I'd be happy to put together some data that might be informative. And if there's any, I will send it along to the group. And if there's anything in addition that you want to know, just ask me and I will make sure you get it.
okay, thank you very much. All right. County and Prosecuting Attorneys Association, Mr. Worrell. Patiently waiting.
Am I talking now? Okay,
You're definitely talking.
I got a question for you. How do you know I was patient?
Well, based on your head gesture, I assume that my assumption may be wrong.
Maybe I was just nodding off. I'm not sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair, Madam Chairman. Members of this esteemed committee, including those over there at the little kids table, no offense. I know because I read this article in the Casper Trib, both Representative Yin and Representative Provenza, as well as Senator Nethercott, did have some thoughts on this matter that they shared with the Tribune, and those have been well represented here this morning. Now I'll say good afternoon, and I'll try to keep my, first, let me ask you another question. How much time do you want me
Let me
to
back you up just a little bit.
Yeah.
I do need to have you formally introduce yourself for the record because it
Okay, I
exists
will
as a public
formally
record.
introduce myself. My name is John P. Worrell. I am the Washakie County Attorney. I am also the president of the Wyoming Association of County and Prosecuting Attorneys.
Thank
Is
you.
that better?
That's perfect.
Good. All right. This isn't a forum
much
I'm
time
used
do
to
you-
working in. I'm used to saying Your Honor, and that's about it. And everybody else
Definitely.
is that guy.
Definitely don't call me that.
I won't call you Your Honor, okay?
But in terms of how much time, I don't know, is a minute long enough?
I can take as long or as little as you want. No,
Why
I
don't you
won't
tell
take-
us
I
what-
won't take too long.
Yeah, you
because-
tell us what you want us to know. And you've been listening to, obviously, your association is integral here. So you've been listening to a lot of the dialogue and feel free to answer some of that.
I have, and also I'll start and end with the same thing, which is my association supports the gathering of the data but it's got to, well, of the data to better make decisions about what to do here. I disagree with Dr. Nunez on this. I think she said she'd like to go the program, then the data, but maybe I misinterpreted that. I'm not throwing rocks at her. She's been at this for 24 years. Here's what I will tell you. You got some definitional issues that you really need to address here, as well as some sort of overview things that I'll give you from the standpoint of being a prosecutor. And I'm a latecomer to this. I was a defense lawyer for 36 years, and I've only been a prosecutor for 6.5. So, but it was an interesting job to step into, and actually quite fascinating in its many facets. First and foremost, I think you got to have a correct definition for what constitutes incarceration or detention. Maybe as broad or as little as that is, you got to know that, because when you read Tennessee Watson's article, it says that we have the highest incarceration rate in the state. Yet you look at some of the statistics that were presented by Director Schmidt this morning, you'll see that we closed a dorm at both the boys' school and the girls' school, and the population there, the census on an average basis is down probably 30%. So how does that point to we're incarcerating more people if that's the primary place we incarcerate juveniles? Of course, there's 4 juvenile detention centers in the state, and you have to take those into account as well. But some people have advocated for the idea of incarceration to include citations. And I'll talk about a little bit about how that all plays here in a minute. So let me just, so take a look at that definition real closely, because it might drive a lot of what you're looking to determine here. And unless you know what that definition is, your data will be meaningless, because everybody will have a different viewpoint of it. So you need to reach a consensus on what you're looking for when you're using that term. That's all I'm saying. I don't care what it is, as long as you know what it is. You have to make the decisions. We're just here to give you guidance, or possibly just information from which you can make the policy decisions. Now, let me speak to this. There's a disconnect in all of this data gathering, and it exists in city and town courts. Many of those courts don't report any data whatsoever. All of those courts impose fines, and some of them have the same crimes as the state would in circuit court. Some counties, some cities, excuse me, charge DUIs, lots of different kind of offenses like that, but they're revenue courts. It's the only court in the state that keeps the revenue in the general fund of the government that funds it. So and I know of some towns and cities that actually watch how much fines are coming in to determine whether their judge is doing a good job or not. I don't know if that's a good measure or not, but they do. So you need to be aware that that's there. I will share my own experience with you in this respect, as respects single point of entry. Single point of entry is extremely critical. It's been around for a long time. I'm a big believer in it. We gather probably twice a week to discuss with our diversion person, who's a young lady that runs a program in our county called Youth Alternatives. It's funded by a variety of means, most of which has been cut this year due to the state's budget cuts. And so she's finding some other funds to go forward with, but it's there. Single point of entry is, we invite the city prosecutor to every single point of entry meeting since I've been there for 6.5 years, and he has attended absolutely this many. And that's not a white power sign or 3, it's 0. Okay, 0. He's not come to one. I'm not going to beg the man. I'm just not going to do it. But he doesn't show up. So how do we affect single point of entry when they won't participate? I'm not the prosecutor in that court. That's a whole different ballgame. You need to be aware of that when you're considering all of this information. You just have to know it, because it's going to show up in the Council for State Governments congregation. I think somebody used that term. I thought it was particularly appropriate for those folks. But it's going to show up in what they calculate, but there's no control that my group has over any of that. It's someone else, and that's what they do. And I'm not throwing rocks at them. It's cities and counties are hurting for money too, or cities and towns. So that's, if they get some that way, I guess that's how they do it. But the problem is juveniles get caught up in that. And I've heard a lot of talk about paying the fines and all this. There is no fines out of Title 14 stuff. They don't fine anybody. There's certain costs that go along, but the biggest one that people don't pay, that I think they should, is parents paying support for their kid while they're in state custody. What's wrong with that? It's called paying your way. They'd pay for them if they're at home. I think, well, I guess he's not here. Representative Wanitzer was speaking to that this morning, except for in the reverse, talking about paying for foster care. It was $642 a month, I think is what he said. It costs to raise a kid in this state. Well, you should hear people cry when they're told they might have to pay child support if their kid's going to the boys' school or the girls' school, or elsewhere, to a foster home, to a group home. Well, that's got to get paid for somehow. Maybe that helps, but they're really bad about paying that. So that's not a fine. That's just an assessment of costs. And that's the only thing you're going to see out of juvenile court. Go to city court, or if there are kids that end up in circuit court as well. And I'm speaking from my own experience here, but there are. Most of the time, they're there because their parents didn't want to choose diversion. They'd rather just have them pay a fine for them, $100, $50, depending on what it is. And they don't even want to worry about the record. And I'm sorry, I just don't have time in the middle of a court proceeding to sit there and negotiate with these people about, hey, you could do better for your kid because they might come out of this on the back end with the record. They don't want to pay it. How do you win them over? And believe me, there's plenty of those folks in this state. There's just plenty of them. And I don't know how many, but they don't want to, and it's their choice. It's their child. This is my point. But some of this stuff is unavoidable. And to count it as a statistic as somehow we're failing makes no sense to me. Again, I think if we correctly define what the data is that you're looking for and who's going to collect it, and then how they're going to arrange it in such a way that allow you guys to make policy decisions based upon that, I think that's doable. I have some ideas for how you might go about doing that. And there was some of them, and I may have missed it this morning, but there's some of them that are addressed in this Chin's report. Did that get dealt with in any detail? Because I wanted to talk about a couple of them. I kind of went through this morning when I was reading it, and I read it the other night too. But here's data challenges. Okay, there's all these different agencies that has responsibility for data. DFS, Department of Health, Department of Education, District and County Attorneys, I think that's me, and the Judicial Branch. All of those, how do you get them to talk to each other? How do you get their systems, their servers, if you will, to talk to each other? You can't. It's almost, you got to overhaul it. And then the data has to maybe be re-entered. I do have a thought, and it's maybe just this. But, and there's no one here from DCI today, but they could tell us more if Frosty Williams was here, he could tell you all about it. But it's the Criminal Justice Information Systems, or the Justice Information Systems. That is an extremely well designed and well thought out and considerably used form of data gathering. And I can tell you as a county attorney, I have to report every case I do to them, which would be all the juveniles that I deal with that ended up going through circuit court or wherever they went. They're going to be in there too. They will be there. That would leave you with just the stuff that comes out of the Title 14 or the city courts. That's the only other places those things could originate. Director Schmidt has a well-developed set of data out of Title 14 cases, both chins and neglected and juvenile delinquents. They have that stuff times 10. I did some research to get ready for this, and I called someone that used to do this and doesn't anymore. I called Edie Troutwine. And Edie was the one that got me pointed in the direction of talking with Director Schmidt. I was driving to Cheyenne on Friday, and she called me. I called her, and she called me back about Wheatland. I talked to her all the way to Cheyenne. We had a great conversation. I learned a lot. But what I will tell you is this. I think if you took those things and you required things to be routed through there, it's a system you already have. You've been looking, Chairman Olson, for a place. How can we collect this? I'm not trying to leave Dr. Nunez out of this by any means. Maybe there's some additional reporting that could take place there. There's some data that you wouldn't get, like recidivism, some things like that. You might have to refine some things to do that. But it's all going to be in one place, and I am not a computer expert, and that's going to be readily apparent in about a minute because you'll exhaust my knowledge of computers. But databases, if they're consistent and they're uniform, can be mined for data considerably. Representative Yin, I think that's something you're pretty strong on. So I'm going to suggest that you might have a better handle on this than I, but I do believe this to be the case. I believe that if the data was all put into one place, then it could be analyzed and broken out into the various and sundry categories of whatever it is you want to deal with. Fairly straightforward. As it is, it comes from all over the place. If you look down through this, each of these systems that I just mentioned, they're all different, every one of them. None of them report the same way. The Supreme Court has one, DFS has another, Department of Health, Department of Education, District and County Attorneys. The only place we regularly report is to WCJIS, Wyoming Criminal Justice Information System. That's where we send all our stuff. About every week, I have to report all that stuff and sign off on it that I did it. So it's not that we're not used to doing it, it's where we're sending it and how we're gathering it. So I can tell you this, Bighorn County, somebody said Bighorn County was a small county. Well, it's 2.5 times as big as where I live. I didn't think about that till the other day and I looked at the population. But I think I did hear one thing that I think would make some sense, and that is whatever monies are being handed out maybe need to be done in an equitable fashion rather than in a pro rata fashion. Because if it's only based upon population, that just amplifies the exigencies of rural living. So I guess so I really wanted to stress that to you. The other thing is resource issues, like in my office. There's me and my deputy, and I have one assistant and a victim advocate. She's got her own job, okay? But and my assistant, honestly, to be really frank, she helps me a lot with the YCGIS stuff, so makes my life easier. She used to do them all and then lay them on my desk. It took me an hour to sign them. But now she just does it and I just say, okay, you know. But the data can be gathered. You've got to address the resource thing. Some of that's we got to get some help for this somewhere. The counties do. And the state's pretty good at passing back the responsibility for paying things. They are. Try to find out how you prosecute a DUI if you want a blood test result. It cost me $240 every time I send one of those in because the state lab can't do them anymore. That's off the topic, but it's an example. And I still want to prosecute the DUI. Representative Oakley knows this. So what do? I guess I fork it over, but sooner or later, the county's going to run out of money. I can tell you Washtenaw County doesn't have any, you know, with the PILT money disappearing and everything else that's going on. We don't have anything. I'm not saying the state does either, but it's a question of what do you do with these resources? So what I've heard here this morning, maybe I'm incorrect, but I think I've heard it this way, is we got a big problem with our juvenile justice system. And there's a whole bunch of things, a bunch of people have a lot of different ideas about what to do with it, but no one said how we're going to pay for it. And I think the best thing we could do before we dive off that cliff, and maybe we need to, I'm not saying we don't, but maybe the best thing we do is we gather the information, we gather the data, we analyze it carefully, we, meaning you, or the LSO folks that do yeoman's work for you all the time. You gather all that data, but it's got to be the same kind of data. You got to look for you got to decide what you're looking for. The Council for State Governments will tell you you're looking for one thing because they have an agenda. Maybe it's a good one, but their agenda is based on states that have 4 or 5 times our population primarily. I think South Dakota might have been the closest of all the ones they listed that was close in population to us. And I think they're only about 3 times as big as we are. Okay, so maybe none of that makes any sense for our state. Maybe we're just unique and we have to face that fact. So we have to deal with it that way. Most of the time, we're kind of proud of the fact that we're unique. This and here, oh no, we should do it like someone else does. Well, I don't know if we need to. What we need to do is get the proper data, see what our system's failings really are, not what we think they might be. And then once we know what the failings are, we can address those and then we can start looking at remedies as well. But that's what the County Attorneys Association supports at this particular moment in time. And no, I don't have any stuff to put up here for you. Okay, I don't. I will, if you ever have something you want us to look at. I have committees established to do more darn things than you can shake a stick at. Okay, I have a committee formed to look at juvenile justice issues, and it's consistent of no elected officials. There's 5 different people that specialize in juvenile justice. 4 of them are prosecutors and one's a juvenile services officer. Okay. And that committee will look at anything you guys come up with. And we'll be able to give you a position, I assure you. And if you want more, we can do more. If you want us to do something, if you want us to give you some research on something or anything else, we're glad to do it. You know, there's a lot of really smart people that are involved with this, with my organization. I'm not one of them, but there are a lot of them. And we can pretty much get anything you want done in pretty short order if we know what it is. But we're in a position where we can't really advocate for a lot of policy because mostly we're reacting to what you folks are doing. So, we can put something out there that says, well, we don't like this because of this, this, and this, or we like this because of this, this, and this, and we can do that if you want. This is the biggest problem we have right now is there's all kinds of data, it's all kinds of places, and no one knows what the heck it means. Council for State Governments tells us, well, we think it'll mean this, but they don't know either. They don't know. Maybe they're not a bad outfit to collect it, but I'll leave that to you to decide. That's not my call. I guess they want money. I thought they did this for free. But it can be collected in other ways. And you might want to look at some of the systems we already have in place that are fairly uniform in their application, and they've been in existence for quite some time. And it might be a good place to start having everybody send this stuff. I think it's the CGIS system. That's just my opinion. So with that, I'll be open for questions, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair.
Senator Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Mr. Worrell, we spent 6 hours talking about data collection. We all agree that, yeah, there's probably a real good use for it. And there's probably some systems in place. But the whole picture here today is juvenile justice. Do you and your organization feel that the juvenile justice system in Wyoming is broken? Does it need fixed, or are we just sitting there beating your heads on the wall?
Like anything else, Senator Cooper, excuse me, Madam Chair, Mr. Chairman, Senator Cooper, I'll try to remember the protocol. There's probably some things that could be improved. I'd be foolish if I said otherwise. But I don't really sit and look at a system for what's wrong with it. I just look at how I work with it. So yeah, I can see some things we could do better, and we could do better consistently from one county to the next to the next. It's telling, and I don't think it's true that there's 14 counties that we can draw conclusions about the other 9 from. I just don't believe that. I believe every county is different. And I think it would be foolish to think otherwise there. But from my standpoint, the kind of things that I've heard talked about here that are good practices and this sort of thing, diversions and no fines and this kind of stuff, we do that already. I very rarely ask anybody for a fine in the courts I deal with, because I figure the school districts are getting way more than the other outfits are. So, I just don't do it. And it's being ordered to be paid by the people that can least afford to pay it. And in the case of juveniles, a lot of times I heard someone say this and they're correct. It's the parents. Which that's just the way it is. I'd pay my kids fine if I had to. Fortunately, I don't think he's got any that I'm aware of, but he might have. But so
Representative
I
Washington.
just don't see a major problem. Is what I guess I'm saying. Excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Worrell, appreciate you being here today. We've heard, I think, 2 big issues, data and resources. If you had to prioritize those 2, would you put more money towards resources at this point in time, or more money into clarifying data?
Mr. Wall.
You really want me to answer that? Yeah, okay. Madam Chair, Mr. Chairman, Representative Washington. It's a great question, and thank you for putting me on the spot. I thought Byron was the only one that ever did that. But I would go with the data, and I'll tell you why. Without the data, the remedies make no sense. They might work, but you won't know why. If they don't work, you won't know why. So if you have good data, and I stress good data, and you got to decide what that is. But if you have good data, then your decision-making processes will be driven. A term that's used kind of pretty regularly in this business seems to be evidence-based. I guess if data is evidence, then you have an evidence-based decision. It's probably more likely to work than not. That's what I have to say about it. That's an opinion too, by the way.
It's fun sitting in our seat, making an opinion about policy. Representative Yin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Worrell, thank you for being here.
Sure.
So I just want to make it clear to understand what the prosecutors are willing to support. Are they willing to support some sort of reporting requirements around juvenile justice so we can determine outcomes, recidivism rates? and other statistics around this so we can actually make policy based on those statistics.
Mr. Worrell.
Can I ask, I hate to do this. I don't hear as well as I used to. Could you speak up? And
Sure.
Speak a little more slowly.
Repre-
And that's my doing, not yours.
Yeah, Mr. Worrell, Representative Yin's question is, will the Prosecutors Association support some type of action to require the reporting of the data, however that may be? You suggested why CJIS, if it was that or something else.
Maybe. And the reason I say that, Mr. Chairman, Representative Yin, is that it would depend on which one it is. And I tossed out the CJIS idea. That's just mine. But there could be others that work just as well. But if they don't appear that they're going to work, no, we could not.
Your maybe is why I have every deal with a lawyer in writing and signed.
There you go.
But it sounds like we have throughout the day, we have, and to Senator Cooper's question, I mean, I wrote down 5 things that you said that we could fix with our justice system, just broadly.
Mhm.
So, I mean, and we all agree on one. Everyone agrees that that the data's out there. We just don't have it refined in front of us. And to take any action without that would probably be negligent, because we don't, unless we have all the data in one place, we don't know exactly what it's saying. You know, we can anecdotally say from one prosecutor to the next, or from one judge to the next, what happens in their jurisdiction. But having that, if it's that YCGIS data and being able to put that data up against the DFS data and look at them together, that should tell us the entire picture. It would certainly tell us who comes in, almost the entire picture.
Mhm.
It'll tell us who comes in through the system, through your folks, minus those city prosecutors. And it will tell us where they get placed or how they get placed, if they're diverted. So it'll tell us a lot. So I think we all agree on that. And you mentioned the definition as well of detention, that maybe we ought to look at that. And I've already polled it so that we have it in front of us. And maybe that is something we need to look at when we're at least understanding that data. What does that mean? So I think we can agree on all of that. And the third thing you said to that list was fines versus assessment of costs.
Mhm.
That we're calling everything a fine, but some of these fines may be assessments of costs, and separating those worlds out will help us understand. And of course, the big one is resource allocation.
Well, Mr. Chair, on that last point, as you know, assessments are established by either statute, in the case of like a drug court assessment or victims compensation, or by court rule. And they have to be collected. There's no forgiveness of them. Sometimes on victims comp you can, but court costs like court technology and legal aid, those are never forgiven. I don't care if a guy's going to jail for the rest of his life, still has them assessed. But those are fine, those are costs and assessments, but fines are always discretionary. And there are no fines that I am aware of under Title 14. Recognize something else too. And this is where you get into the problems of people with records that they didn't intend to have. You're not just drawing out Title 14 and Title 6, criminal cases and juvenile cases. You're drawing out of Title 12, MIPs, stuff like that. Drawn out of Title 35, drug offenses. That's a big deal. And sometimes you're drawn out of, what is it? I'm trying to remember where this would fit. Well, there's one that I know is on the books that you may want to look at if you want to eliminate one problematic thing, and that is youthful offender DUIs. It goes on your record. It's a .02. No adult in the state would ever be convicted of such a
Sold,
thing.
done. I'll have that bill drafted.
Yeah, well, you're young enough, it might have happened to you. No, sorry.
Mr. Worrell, I don't know enough about YCGIS, but just to confirm, maybe even Representative Oakley, because when we had this conversation earlier, I guess Representative Oakley, you didn't mention it, but I assume my question is all prosecutors, minus the city prosecutors, all county prosecutors and the district attorneys have to report into YCGIS every
Yes,
charge.
they do. Now, when that gets reported might be differ from county to county. When I took office, there was a stack this high sitting on my desk. That was a matter of circumstance. So I sat down and in a week it was gone, but it takes a while, okay? Nowadays, the data is entered online, so it happens a lot quicker. You don't have to fill out a form, sign it and send it. It happens a little more quickly, but that data has to be entered. It's the same thing as anything else. If we don't report this to NCIC, which is what the Criminal Justice Information System is, we don't report it, it's garbage when we get a record back on someone else. You can see where prosecutors don't, not in this state necessarily, but I get them from all over the United States. And when I'm looking somebody up, I can see where there's no disposition, contact prosecutor for disposition, this kind of thing, means they didn't report it. So you got to make them do it.
That's my question. Is the YC just a statutory reporting a requirement of county prosecutors?
I never wanted to find out if there's a penalty for not.
None of my prosecutors are speaking, so they don't want to know either.
That's right. I'm pretty sure that Representative Oakley and Representative Crago.
Representative Oakley, do you know, are you statutorily required to report up in YCGIS?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I actually don't know about a statutory requirement, but I guess I'm going to draw possibly a very big distinction in this discussion, which is Title 14 is something different.
It is, but that
And-
data exists.
And so my concern with starting from the starting point that you just said, Mr. Chair, that it's out there is my concern is that that is not the case with juvenile offenses. And I think we'd hear that from probably both Dr. Nunez and the director. So, I mean, I think we're looking in the future for getting this. You know, I mean, I feel like at this point, we've talked about it endlessly, if I hear the word data again. But, and maybe I'm wrong, I've turned to Representative Yin. It doesn't seem like this would be rocket science to put some parameters around and get some reporting. Certainly for some of these smaller than 9, having some funding to go around and make sure that the data is entered consistently. And you used some good word, what was it, consistently and whatever. You know, to start going forward and getting some consistent data doesn't seem like for all the discussion for 24 years of it would be as difficult to get to as it seems. I don't know, but it seems like that's where we're headed. But I think the assumption that we can go back and that's there. One of the things about Title 14 with confidential information is that a lot of this stuff like stays on paper and isn't entered in computers specifically to respect that confidentiality, and therefore it isn't necessarily memorialized as well as it should be. Something we need to discuss as far as this next step, the solution, which I hope we're getting there on figuring out a way to basically to fund and get moving forward on data collection with juvenile stuff in the future. I don't think we can count on that it's all there in the past. That's my sense of it.
Don't count on what?
Mr. Chair, count that the data is there for us to just go get from the past and have it to use. I don't think that that's the case, unfortunately.
Mr. Chair, Representative Oakley, I'm thinking of it more as a platform moving forward. And it would require some changes to get there. In fairness to Director Schmidt, I think the Title 14 data is pretty well reported. If you look at it pretty close, I know in the past when I've seen it, it's always well reported. So that might be, it's just, it doesn't talk to the other ones. You see, this is the problem.
Further questions for Mr. Worrell?
I'm about to get one, I think.
Well, we're just looking at the DCI reporting requirements. Yeah, I agree with what Representative Oakley is saying. What blows my mind is that for 24, 25 years, I don't believe we could be the first committee to say, hey, why don't we have the data, and why why is it in all of these places and we can't just have it synthesized, but maybe that is the reality it's there, but so I think we understand a potential action item, which is, we have to, some type of reporting mechanism on the data. And we can wrestle with that. And it sounds like our county prosecutors are at least willing to work with us.
As long as I'm around, they will be.
As
Yes,
long as
Mr.
you're,
Chairman.
we'll keep you around then.
Well, until January the 5th of 2023. That's when I'm done.
That's
Yes.
retirement.
Yes, it is, sir. Real quickly, and then I'll be done.
Okay.
Representative Oakley hit on a very sticky point, and that is the confidentiality of, particularly in juvenile cases, of that personal identifying information. That is true as well, as most of you know from having to redact everything you file with the court. Anybody that's done that, I do it all the time. Representative Oakley and Representative Crago also do it. That personal identifying information is a big deal now. So a way to affect who gets that information and what they do with it, you need to be mindful of that, lest you tread on somebody's personal rights. And I know you wouldn't want to do that. So that's a big hurdle to jump. And it was identified earlier in this, and I used it as an example, but it's the same data in this CHINS report. Okay. Read that again real close, because all those challenges are the ones you face, but they can be overcome. It's just a matter on where you want to look at it. CGIS is my idea. I don't know if anybody else thinks that's right, but I just thought it kind of made sense because it is thorough and there's a lot of ways to mine it. So there you go.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Worrell.
Thank
We
you.
appreciate it. All right, committee and public, here's what we're gonna do. Because we're a little bit behind. So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna take a 5-minute break. We're gonna come back and we're gonna finish out public comments by the 4 o'clock hour, which doesn't seem like a lot of time, but we don't need a lot of time because I think we're pretty honed in on where we want to be. And this is only I'm reminding the public, this is only the introduction of our topic. So as we refine it in our future meetings, that public comment will become integral as we move forward with it as well. So that's the game plan. And then we'll move into Title 25 when we come back at 4, and I'm confident we'll do that in 1 hour. No, maybe. Yeah, we'll do it in an hour. All right, break time. Co-chairman Nethercott? You'll wait? Okay. Oh, okay. Representative Washit making his way to his seat. We appreciate that. Sure they'd love to hear this public comment, so. But we'll start. Let's start by getting a sense of public comment. If you're in the Zoom world and you have something to say on the topic, go ahead and raise your little virtual hand so we can get an idea. And those in the room, who plans on testifying on this topic from the public? All right, we got 2. Do we have any virtual hands? 1 virtual hand? All right. Let's dispense with the virtual hand.
Am I on?
Well, you cut out, welcome, but go ahead and introduce yourself now.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairman. My name is Cheryl Folland, and I'm the legislative advocate for the Wyoming Association of Addictions Professionals. And just briefly would like to just support Dr. Nunez's information on how the importance of good qualified data is. GMO, garbage in, garbage out, influences our decision processes. I am also a licensed clinical social worker in Rollins, and I am a child trauma therapist. And many of my clients are justice involved clients. And not only do we have significant mental health issues that obviously are taking over, the CDC has recognized not only is Wyoming the #1 state in the US for suicides, but also we are hitting #1 and #2 for teen suicides. We also are seeing significant addiction issues. And when we talk about the services available, data is good. We do also need those services. We have very few, very limited inpatient and outpatient services available for youth in Wyoming, which is also a significant issue. Not all mental health providers can provide substance abuse treatment, and not all substance abuse treatment providers can provide mental health. So that is also a significant challenge that we face in these issues. And as Mr. Worrell was stating, as far as the county attorneys, there's no consistency in how CHINS is done. The single point is obviously so vital and so important. And so are CHINS petitions, but we have a significant proportion, at least in my county, in my experience, of children that don't get into the CHINS process as soon as they could, just for, again, that lack of services and timing situations. So just to encourage the committee that there is so much more that really needs to be looked at that sits on the outskirts from a service provider's perspective. And with that, I stand for any questions.
Committee. All right, we very much appreciate you joining us and your testimony. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, let's move to Ms. Sheen. Representative Oakley, while you were out, you didn't miss much on testimony. It was just more on the need for data.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, my name is Donna Sheen, and I am the director of the Wyoming Children's Law Center. And much like Ms. Nunez, I've also been doing this for quite a few years. I first started in working on juvenile justice in 2001, when the legislature took another stab at really going through the juvenile justice statutes. One of the things I think might be important, and I know we don't have time today to do it, is for you to get a little bit more history on what has been tried and why has the data problem been as hard to solve as you've been talking about today. So I'm going to commit to putting together something in writing that will give you a little bit broader view of what causes the problem. But I just ask for you to keep in mind that jurisdiction is part of that conundrum, because data can be hard to get when you have more courts involved. So when you have municipal courts, circuit courts, and also because the grant of concurrent jurisdiction, where prosecutors get to choose which court or no court diversion, that also creates its own problems in terms of where the data will reside. And then how often you may be creating redundant systems that then require you to put data in multiple systems multiple times, which gets frustrating. And so you'll see, I think, pushback when you start honing in on the answer with those kind of problems, if you don't consider the different counties and how they do set up their system. So I would encourage you to reach out to all of the county attorneys and district attorneys and ask them to provide you with a written copy of their single point of entry objective criteria, because that is what you require in the statute. And most, in my experience, most of them do now have some kind of a written plan of how they are going to view different offenses and process them. So I think that would be a great help for the committee to gather that. I didn't think about asking for that beforehand, but I think the committee, the prosecutors would be happy to provide that. One of the other reasons why I think it would be important for you to look at that is, even though diversion has been a wonderful addition, it isn't in statute at all. And I believe it probably needs to be in order for us to really clarify what it is and where it should be used. I'd also encourage you to take a look at other states, and I'm going to put together a summary of some of the surrounding states on how other states do jurisdiction, because most of them have some offenses that they leave in these adult lower courts, but generally they're traffic offenses that don't involve a ability to send a child to detention. So, you know, the failure to yield that leads into an accident, those kinds of things aren't brought in other states, but they're also not allowed to be a sentence of detention. Whereas in Wyoming, you not only see children going into detention through the juvenile court system, but also in municipal court. So the other piece of data that I think you should definitely seek is Volunteers of America is required as part of their federal grant to maintain the detention center information on what children are going into detention. And I believe they keep that now by court. So you'd be able to see what children might be sentenced to detention through a municipal court proceeding where they would not even be in the DFS system. So then you're removing children from the home, and really our system that's supposed to be monitoring that and preventing it isn't really connected with that child. I think you heard a little bit from Ms. Schmidt about the fact that not all kids in juvenile justice are DFS kids. I think it's important to take a look at what kids aren't, because I believe as part of the Family First initiative, that's a big problem when you have children who are struggling in a juvenile justice process, but because they're not in a juvenile court, they may not be getting access to the services that could prevent removal, could be recognized as something where there is a heightened need for supervision, or there's a need for a referral to some of the great programs that we've created in the state for diverting children from court altogether and putting them into the mental health system, for example, using wraparound services to help families. So all of those system issues, I mean, that's really why juvenile justice is such a complex problem, because of all of those different little challenges that end up making it very difficult to see a unified system. And as part of that, I just don't want us to forget the fact that because of some of these problems with the system, reasonable minds can differ about what our confinement rate is, whether you call it confinement or incarceration. And I certainly agree that every state differs, and we could argue about whether we confine more kids. But the issue is, there is no doubt, if you get the records of children in custody, there is no doubt that different counties in Wyoming do it very differently. And you will see incredible differences in terms of counties that take a lot of children out of the home and place them into residential settings, boys' school, girls' school, and other counties that do a magnificent job in keeping all of their children within the community, finding ways to serve them. So I urge you to take a look at that as well, because I believe you'll find wonderful examples to build on and try and promote as part of your work this year. And with that, I apologize I did go over, but I will stand for any questions.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I hesitate to ask, but why do you think it is that some counties have higher rates of keeping in the home and other counties have higher rates of shipping them off? Any, I guess, analysis or maybe just personal opinion?
Ms. Sheen.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Zwanitzer, it's a great question. I think Senator Cost asked something kind of similar. And what came to my mind at first was, there's just different perceptions, different buy-in. I think some communities start from a different place philosophically. I think community juvenile service boards have a big impact on that and who serves on them. I've seen real differences. Our office works with, tries to work with prosecutors across the state to help them identify ways to improve, how they set up their single point of entry systems. And I think that prosecutors are also in a very tough spot. They're elected officials. The community has expectations about them. And so if you were in a community where schools want to, frankly, push those kids that are problematic out, they want answers that they feel like they don't have. Prosecutors sometimes feel that pressure of having more kids in the system that are maybe children with disabilities who need something different, but it's sometimes hard to navigate the different politics you have at a local level. But I also think it's a huge lack of training and opportunity for those resources and collaboration. I think even though prosecutors are doing the best they can, and I really do want to convey what a hard job I've watched them and what a difficult thing this is. And they're in kind of no-win situations. And what this legislature could do is provide a clearer framework so they don't have maybe as much discretion in areas where discretion shouldn't be available, because that means that community pressures might push you to maybe remove more children from the community than is really wise to do.
Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Sheen, for being here today. I asked a couple questions of Ella earlier that I think we didn't have an answer to, and you might, given your position. Are you aware of an age of culpability in the state of Wyoming? So a minimum age in which someone can be adjudicated as a juvenile, say, should a 4-year-old be prosecuted? And then additionally, are you aware of any requirements of parental consent in, say, law enforcement questioning of juveniles, and what parameters might exist around that?
Ms. Sheen.
Chairman Olson, Representative Provenza, I do know there isn't anything in statute that has a requirement for, we have no minimum floor of age, and that is certainly one of the areas of jurisdiction that I think it would be very wise for this committee to talk about, setting an age under which a child shouldn't even be in a court process. We do have a Wyoming Supreme Court decision that says that a child does have to be competent in order to be in a court proceeding, even if it's a juvenile court proceeding. And so, and we know from research that most children 12 and under are not going to be competent. So I do think there's sort of a movement nationwide to set 12. Some states are setting a little lower. I've seen discussions around at least 10. But certainly, I think there's a need for that because again, that can provide prosecutors with a black and white rule that says, I understand you, that 8-year-old, maybe brought a knife to school, but we have to handle that differently because a court proceeding isn't the right kind of action. As far as questioning youth, same problem. We don't have much guidance around that. I've certainly dealt with a number of cases where parents were very frustrated that school and law enforcement officers questioned their children at school before they were given notice or having an opportunity to be with their child. And I know we tried to deal with it a few years back. Our center put together a committee and we offered some model memorandum of understanding language for school districts and law enforcement to try and give them some ideas of best practice. And I'll be happy to provide that resource to the committee as well. So you can see we compiled the national, some of the US Supreme Court cases on that to help everybody know there is some guidance in federal law in terms of constitutional cases that have been decided.
Yeah, we'd love to have a couple of things there, just even if you could send us a quick email on the law. So what are those federal cases? What do they specifically say? I imagine there's probably a lot out there, but what's just the general rule there? And then the memorandum concept is interesting because I think that is a potential legislative avenue within this topic is, if we're going to set a policy, that's certainly something the legislature could tackle, that parental consent be required before law enforcement questioning, and that kind of dovetails back to the custody question too. We'd have to have a firm definition of detention or custody or whatever it means, because obviously that's when this type of policy would kick in. But we'd be happy to, if you would be happy to share those resources, we'd be happy to look at them.
Mr. Chairman, I can certainly do that, and I will try and provide more resources to the court. We have accumulated quite a few over the years. I just didn't want to overwhelm everybody with too much at once.
Anything else? All right.
Thank you, Mr.
Machine.
Chairman.
All right, the gentleman in the tie. And just as a quick reminder, my goal of 4 o'clock was 14 minutes ago, so.
I will be very brief, Mr. Chairman and Madam Co-Chairman. My name is Bruce Berkland, and I'm a staff person for the Wyoming Youth Service Association. Our members are provide services for crisis shelters and group homes and most of the residential treatment programs in the state, and one of the PRTFs. And many of our members have, or almost all of our members also provide prevention programs within their communities. I believe you received a handout for me. There's a 1-pager on 2 sides that's identifiable because it's not on any letterhead because I'm technically challenged. So basically this paper says that we believe that people within Wyoming have worked hard within the juvenile justice system to create a system that's helpful for the youth and their families and the communities, but certainly there can be improvements. And as a group, we would very much welcome the opportunity to be involved in that process and helping that move forward. The paper also points out that when looking at the present system that we have and comparing with other states, it's important that we compare apples to apples, and points out some examples of how that can be difficult. And I certainly don't need to read those, but I will mention a couple on here that I think stand out for us. And that is Adoption and Foster Care Analysis Reporting System, which is called AFCARS, which reports on children in custody and what's considered federal foster care. So that includes relative and non-relative foster care, group homes, residential treatment centers. It does not include the institutions or detentions, doesn't include the boys' school or girls' school. When you look at that data and compare it, that on any given day during the course of a year, Wyoming ranks about 15th in terms of children in placement. If you also look, however, over the course of the year, Wyoming is has more kids, one of the states with one of the highest rates of kids in placement, and that is feasible or possible in terms of, I think Director Schmidt had alluded to that or mentioned that, in that we also have one of the median length of stay is one of the shortest in the country, and we have probably the highest rate of family reunification. So it's a complex, it's not just a simple data point. I'd also point out that the Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquent Preventions data, which is the census of juveniles in residential placements, that those do include group home and residential treatment and boys and girls school and detention centers. It does not include foster care children. But in those, when you look at that, in 2017, Wyoming had the highest rate of placements in public facilities, but ranked 12th in placements in private facilities, the group homes and residential treatment. And in 2019, that was third highest in the public facilities and 15th in private facilities. Also, I'd point out the CJRP data does not include facilities that are specifically identified for mental health and substance abuse treatment. The residential treatment programs in WISA, I think, would consider themselves there for mental health treatment centers, but because of the way the system, our system, and if we were in other systems or in other states, we do not believe those children would probably be counted into the CJP data. The one other thing I would just point out is that all those databases include group homes, and group homes vary a great deal from state to state. In Wyoming, those are no larger than 10 students. They're community-based programs. There's 14 around the state. They have 2 staff at all times. Children are able to interact with families within their communities. In other states, they can be as large as 200 children from in and out of state, and are frequently for-profit operations, as opposed to all WISA members are private and nonprofit. And with that, I stand for any question.
Committee questions from Mr. Berkman? All right, thank you for your testimony. We appreciate it. And thank you for the 1.5 pager. All right, any other public comment? Oh, Director Shannon.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Chair, committee members, I'm Dan Shannon with the Department of Corrections. Excuse me, I'll be very brief. Just some points of clarification of questions that were raised today with Stephanie Duraz and CSG's presentation. One question was asked was regarding the recent legislation. What's the revocations happen? And throughout the past year, it was reduced by 23%. We were cautioned that COVID and budget cuts will certainly have an impact. And there's no doubt that the COVID will have impact, but I want to report that our budget cuts will not affect our vision nor our policies. Regarding the outcome of agencies working together, working extremely well with the courts as well as Department of Health. We are currently the Department of Corrections. We're housing 1 individual under age of 18. We have 23 individuals that are under supervision. All are certified as adults. One question was raised was what's our daily average count? I think by the chairman, it was 2196 as of today. One member recently asked me, we do self-reported data through one of our assessments. 25% of our individuals that are incarcerated report being in a juvenile system. So Department of Corrections surely would support more concrete information as well as any initiative to slow down incarceration. So I stand for questions if you have any.
Questions for the director, Representative Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The one offender under age 18 is housed in Wyoming or out of state?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Washington, he's housed out of state. He has 3 more years to go. And we felt it was best to house him in a juvenile facility instead of our adult system. I made that decision and at no cost to the state through interstate compact. Upon his 18th birthday, we'll return him to Wyoming.
Co-chairman Nethercutt.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Director Shannon, it's great to have you here and your very helpful comments and information. You've, I think, been with us most of the day, or if not been listening at some level, and can hear some of the frustration from the committee members about kind of the fixation on the data. And we've spent almost a day talking about that. And I understand because I've been there before. And so I'm going to leverage you here on CSG's previous work on criminal justice reinvestment. When we did that, I was pretty skeptical of that effort, but found their work to be very helpful and guided some pretty, I think, surprising outcomes that they provided, which led us to some different directions that directly impacted the Department of Corrections. Primarily, one of the driving factors for our inmate population was from probation revocations, and probation agents are under the Department of Corrections. And so there was kind of this belief, and we heard for many years that our prison population was increasing. And certainly that was because we had zealous police and judges who were just punishing and sentencing punitively for these excessive rates. And in reality, that's not the case, or that certain lawmakers were making too many felonies. Also not the case. But maybe what was contributing to that was probation revocations that went against best practices or best judgment. And I know the Department of Corrections, both under your leadership and Director Lampert, were very responsive to that particular finding. And that study and that effort for criminal justice reinvestment, just as some reminder from history to the committee, was really at the direction of Governor Meade and the leadership of the legislature through President Bebout and Speaker Harshman at the time, that all reached out with a consensus to CSG to come into our state and open up some of that data set to help us provide some of those guiding principles. And the reason for that was we obviously were facing budget reductions and there was a need to reevaluate resources. So similarly in this vein is where we are with juvenile justice, the review and hearing some of these conversations. So for the committee's benefit, and CSG was invited here by us, we are, as a member of the Wyoming legislature, we're a part of them. And so, and there's a long history here in this state of working with them in recent years. And I think Director Shannon can be part of that. So you have questions about the Department of Corrections experience working with CSG and some of the data that came out of that. And if he would find similar quality of research to be value added for what is a juvenile population that may or may not end up in his population as well, is an important fact. Certainly would invite those questions for the director.
I think you said it all. Co-chairman Nethercutt summarized our 8-hour day.
Madam
Do you have
Chair,
anything you'd like to respond with, Director?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to respond to Madam Chair's questions, or I guess statement. It's very difficult, as we're all aware, to take a look at ourselves and what CSG did bring to our agency. And it was, Madam Chair stated correctly, that it was a result of the budget cuts under Governor Meade's administration. They bring a wealth of information that we're not reinventing the wheel over and over. They've tested it so many times. Now, it's not always fitting for Wyoming, so we have to sort through that. But implementation and recommendations for certain legislations, or more importantly, policies. The true fact is that we have more revocations than we do commitments from our courts. And that's what I'm working very diligently on. So CSG was very helpful to that. I'm certainly not going to discuss the courts, the police, or who's sitting at the children's table today. Those are things I won't say. But it was very helpful. We're not reinventing the wheel. And I believe we're having a good product right now. So thank you.
That's good to hear. I mean, it was a multi-year effort and a lot of energy put into that. And even out of the legislation that we passed, there was a multitude of bills beyond that, that just time, not necessarily that they were bad ideas. It's just a lot of time drain on a part-time legislature to work on a lot of that legislation.
It's reaping its benefits now, Mr. Chairman.
Good.
Thank you.
That's good to hear. Committee? All right.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thanks for your
Director
time.
Shannon. Okay, kind of bringing this home, committee, and I want to, I want to express my gratitude to the committee, especially we have a lot of really new members and new to the legislature, new to this committee. And so this could be, unless you serve on other committees, your first or one of your first interim meetings. So really, this is a topic that generally you would probably have gone through 5 different topics by now, and that sometimes makes it a little easier when the information and people and presentations are changing. So I really just appreciate the committee buckling down and sitting through this. It's a massive topic that could probably take up a lot more time. The goal is to try to refine that into, we've been talking about juvenile justice broadly, and I think trying to refine it into some actionable items would obviously make our time better spent in the future. I think just to kind of get some of those out of the way while we're here before we move on to the next topic. And I know that the Senate usually doesn't work past 4 o'clock, but and my newer House members wouldn't appreciate this. My older ones would, because we served together in the hardest working House in America. So we generally work till about 11 o'clock in the House of Representatives. That's changed, but that's what we used to do anyway. So, some action items. I think one thing that's going to come from today is certainly a working group to begin honing deeper into some things. But I think we have some potential legislation in front of us. The data reporting legislation seems like an obvious bill that I think would make Representative Oakley very happy to not hear about. And I obviously I think the starting point of that is where the prosecutors want it to be. That makes the most sense to me, since the prosecutors are the ones entering the data. I know we have a statute dealing with YC just reporting to DCI, but I don't think it's actually mandatory. And I don't know exactly what the action item has to be with that, but if we want the data, we have to ask for the data. Or we have to fund a block grant and say, hey, if you participate in the block grant, now you give us some data. But the reality is if we want the data, we simply have to do more than just ask for it. So that would be one. And I think we can wrestle with different opportunities with that going forward. I think one of the largest things that we can do that's at least in front of us is we have this 25 years ago, these efforts that were started on juvenile justice in the council, and there seems to be a tremendous disconnect between the legislature and this council that some of us serve on but don't realize we serve on it as a legislative liaison. And so that's a huge disconnect, because the ability for that council to do more than just receive a $25,000 federal stipend, that's just to have a meeting. They can't do, what can they possibly do without state of Wyoming funding? Nothing. But because there's a disconnect between that council and the legislature, there's simply not a whole lot moving forward on that, at least not from the legislative standpoint. So I think that would be a second action item would be looking at the statute that creates the working group or it's not the working group, sorry, that creates the council, and considering everything we're talking about, that may be our vehicle where we can write into statute the mission. We can look back at the mission of that council and we can broaden it, narrow it, hone it, whatever we want to do. But with the issues that we're wrestling with, that seems like the vehicle is already there. We just have to we just have to modify the vehicle and move it forward. You don't have to create an additional task force or since it's already under the joint judiciary, which is a logical place for it, we have to just rework the mission of that. Those are the immediate thoughts on my mind. I think diversion, whether that's statewide or not, whether it's mandated, defined, what does it mean? How do you use it? And then we have some side questions, of course, some side issues that Representative Provenza brought up, which I think we might take a deeper look at based on Ms. Sheen's email. But that seems like if there were a motion for that bill draft, it seems like a very simple bill draft, which is just a bill to require parental consent for questioning of juveniles in custody or something of that nature.
And Mr. Chairman,
Yeah.
with your indulgence, I did some very hasty looking into this a bit earlier today, and happy to provide that very quickly.
Please.
I'm sorry.
Please.
Oh, yeah. The Juvenile Justice Act only specifies, as far as I can tell, that there's a requirement that at an initial hearing, the child and the parents presumably are required to be there, are advised of the child's right to remain silent. And then statute, I believe it's 14.6.223, codifies that right to remain silent and can decline to testify as a witness or what have you in that proceeding. Did a very quick search of case law and found no cases, at least the Wyoming Supreme Court, in a very, very quick search that talk about the right to a parent present during questioning or the advisement that you can have that right if you so choose. The only Wyoming case I did find, it was from 2013, SWM is the initial, and this was, I believe, perhaps the case Ms. Sheen was referring to, where the individual was 12 years old and was found not to be competent to proceed through an adjudication of delinquency. The court noted that a child has a due process right not to proceed with an adjudication unless that child is competent to do so. The court noted, I believe it's 711-303, which provides the process for a court to determine whether a person, and this is just general criminal procedure statute, whether a person is competent to stand trial. In terms of what other states, just a couple of examples, North Carolina has a statute that outlines the interrogation procedures for a juvenile and certain advisements that must be given to that juvenile and rights afforded before that questioning takes place. South Dakota Supreme Court has held in a case that statements that were made by a child without the child's parents present were considered involuntary and could not be used in any sort of adult or juvenile court proceeding. That court, in scanning that case, there is a mention of the kind of the totality of circumstances. So, different case may yield a different result, but that's a quick kind of 5-minute search and breakdown, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Well, it seems like, sorry, Representative Washit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. During testimony today, we heard a couple of folks refer to some technical legal situations, which I think they said were quirky and murky. And so I would hope that if we're going to draft a bill pertaining to juvenile justice, that we also asked LSO to draft some definitions on some of these quirky and murky terms that there seems to be a lack of agreement presently on what those terms are, such as diversion, detention, placement, what falls into what category. I think it's going to be really essential for us to define those terms more distinctly than they are presently.
Here's
According to CSG.
okay. I mean, yeah, Representative Washit, one action item could certainly be looking at the definition of detention. And we have that statutorily defined. It means a temporary care of a child in a physically restricting facility pending court disposition or the execution of a court order to place or commit a child to a juvenile detention facility. But I think that goes hand in hand with Representative Provenza's legislative request on questioning in detention or in custody anyway. It's in custody. Well, we statutorily, we don't have a definition for custody.
Mr. Co-Chairman, if I might, I think what Representative Provenza is discussing is the questioning of a minor concerning their participation in a crime, whether that might be on the street, whether they might be quote unquote detained, or whether or not they're in the police station or in their parents' living room, as opposed to confinement, incarceration, detention facility after they have been taken into the court's custody and are placed in those facilities. I would distinguish those two concepts, that what Representative Provenza is discussing and the quirky murkiness in the law for data collection for what is diversion versus what is confinement are completely separate and apart.
So we use the word detention in two different ways, but the question is whether, to Representative Washit's point, whether we need to look at the definition of detention for data reporting purposes. I don't know that we do. I mean, in my conversation with the director, I was able to quickly look at the data points and decide who's in a facility and who's not in a facility. I don't think that that's difficult. I think people looking at the data need to understand what it means when you have just under 400 individuals in a system and some are in a group home and some are in the boys' school. What does that mean? But to Mr. Worrell's point, Mr. Worrell brought up some people may consider fines. I think he said detention. To me, I would never consider that. So maybe that's part of the murkiness in the definition. Is that a request for some legislative action, Representative Washit?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I do think that when we draft a data reporting bill, that some clarification of these types of topics, not just for within the state of Wyoming, but when folks write articles that compare us to other states, that we've got some definitions that we can have much more clarity in our discussion of the topic.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
And Mr. Co-Chairman, I think that's a decent idea. And we heard that consistently throughout the day was the need for definitions so that everyone understood that what the data that they were entering was going into the right box. So it could be used accordingly. The question is, should that be in statute or should that be in some particular agency's rules and regs? And which agency should that be? That's a question I think that we should consider more fully over who should be the keeper of the data. Should that be DCI? And then should we direct them to create rules and regulations associated with juvenile data and how that's to be held and stored, which obviously must be differently. And that way they can have some flexibility associated with some of those definitions as opposed to statutorily, recognizing that throughout the course of time, we heard testimony today as well that diversion has been a concept that's been stood up over the last 24 years. And so as there's new best practices and new ideas and trends for the treatment of issues that are facing juveniles in the criminal justice system, that those agencies are in a position to be flexible with that as opposed to statutory definitions. So for lack of a better agency to house the data, I would suggest that a reporting requirement be placed on the Department of Criminal Investigation, because they're good at keeping things secret theoretically, and they are required to create rules and regs associated with the keeping of juvenile information, which they probably already have to some degree.
That's the YCGIS system, right? Yeah.
We sit down our questions.
Yep, we're still taking requests. Brian, I can see Brian typing. I know this is how I just like I said earlier, I just randomly say things and Brian somehow drafts beautiful bills, so.
And I'm not sure, Mr. Chairman, if I want a bill draft or it's more of a Danielle research memo. But I would be interested in knowing what other states around us pay for foster care, residential care, congregate care. If we're on average, at least from what I'm seeing, it seems like we're all paying less and there's less foster parents, which then forces in some counties kids into group homes or higher levels than they need to be, costing everyone more money. And then also, I guess it's probably a research request as well. The average number of cases or children per caseworker, and I know that might be a little tough because you have, probation parole, you have chins, there's a variety of social service workers, but perhaps what the caseload of other states is, the number of minors per social worker. I'm not sure what the official term of DFS employees are, but caseworkers, thank you. What other states have if they have maximum ratios or where we are in conjunction. I do think that what ended up as a 3% cut, even though it's only 3%, is superbly detrimental, more than people realize, to the entire process. Same with mental health and some other things we're not looking at today, but those cuts are really actually, I think, going to cost us more. So some data would be great.
Okay. Anything else? Representative Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just piggybacking on the advisory council's 2020 recommendations that you mentioned earlier. I hate to see all that work go to waste, those recommendations. And so I'm curious as to whether or not we can put a price on some of those recommendations that they've made, what that looks like, and whether or not some of the COVID relief money could be used for some of those mental health services for youth.
What are the 2020 recommendations? Is that that was like the final slide of the presentation? Is that what you're referring to? There was a list.
There was a list.
Representative Zwanitzer.
Thanks. Perhaps a request. Ms. Sheen talked about, and I think it's true, that some counties tend to do better than others when it comes to the system and turning them over to the boys' school, various levels of treatment they might not need. And I don't know what the answer is, and I don't know if there's a way to stabilize or standardize the current law. I don't know if there's a model act of the single point of entry when you come in, what to look for and what the maximum level of care should be. But I would like to pursue that a little bit further on maybe the data for now on per capita each county. And it may just be, it's, the least populated counties have the least amount of resources to have those type of community services. But I do think that's an expensive area that we need more investigation into. And so maybe some research, or if there's a model act that has, here's a standard for a point of entry and what levels of care should be and what the practice is, whether that's statutory or not, I'm not sure, Mr. Chairman.
I thought you were going to say consolidate those counties into the other counties, the ones that are actually reporting. I solve multiple problems with that.
I believe I've told Representative Craig about 6 times today, if we didn't have that many counties, we might not have some of these issues.
Yeah, so would that be, Ms. Sheen had mentioned putting the diversion in statute, what it is and when to use it? Is that what, if there's some type of a model act on that?
I think there's some
Is that
type
what
of
you're
model that
asking?
would be great. I'm hesitant to ask for a bill draft when I don't
know what it
there
says.
might be various reasons that if we investigate. But however the chair
It will be,
persons want to go back.
okay. Well, we can certainly, we can take that as an ambiguous action item and see what we come up with. Okay. Representative Craig, you got any brilliant ideas? All right. Now's your opportunities to ask for, and just to go back to Representative Williams's point, I think that fits with one of the first things I was talking about on reworking the mission. You know, look at the statute that creates the council. And if some of their action items, I don't remember what's on the list, but fit within a future for that council, maybe that's the way to fit some of that in. Representative Provenza.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just in line with the questions I'd asked earlier, it sounds like Mr. Fuller has some preliminary information that I would like to have. I'm not sure I want to request a bill draft at this point, but understand the process, right? What does the process for juvenile entry into criminal justice through law enforcement questioning prior to adjudication and the court procedure look like? Or what place guards do we have in place?
So, and well, a couple of things, and especially for the newer members, maybe. So we have 3 interim meetings. And so, you know, just because you request a bill draft doesn't mean that much goes, honestly, if it's a time consideration, it could take less time to draft a bill than it could to provide additional research. So it doesn't necessarily save our staff time to do that. And if we are considering a legislative action, now is definitely the time to request the bill drafts on the topics, because we're going to, between now and the next meeting, Mr. Fuller is going to work on preparing those. And then when they're presented, they'll be presented with more information at the next meeting. Otherwise, you do have one last opportunity to gather more information, have a bill drafted at the second meeting before, you know, anything we vote is when we get to the final meeting anyway. So just as a process concept, carefully trying to weigh the amount of research we put on our staff and the amount of bills. But so I guess whatever you'd like, but.
Mr. Co-Chairman, I would say that today feels a little bit differently, I think, for many of the committee members, because it's not our typical style of doing an interim meeting where we do an hour on a topic that's very narrowly tailored, very discreet, and let's do a bill draft on that. Got a second? All right, we've got a bill draft. This is different. And so there's a level of frustration because it feels a little off measured. This is a review of the state's entire juvenile justice system. It doesn't necessarily require 10 bill drafts to come out of it, right? We're looking at how it operates in total. What we have learned today is a tragic lack of any information for how our juvenile justice system operates, except for local commentary that everything is just fine, right? That's really what we're hearing. So it's a little bit difficult for us to know how to take the appropriate action items. I think one piece we came out of this or prior to the discussion was understanding why there's those data gaps and how do we solve them? And would it be prudent to invite CSG in to do something similar to criminal justice reinvestment? Which again, those meetings when we overhauled criminal justice reinvestment, it was a 2-year study and there were meetings that looked just like today, where we were rapidly moving through topics and doing bill drafts. And so just kind of a comfort level with it looking a little bit different for today. And we don't, you know, Representative Provenza's concerns, I think, are an offshoot maybe of the juvenile justice system of looking at processes associated uniquely within the juvenile system, but not necessarily its operations and statewide. And also kind of presupposes some facts that law enforcement has to be involved before a juvenile comes into the system. But those are my comments to kind of get the committee away from necessarily bill drafts regarding process and maybe more of how our juvenile justice system is working in total, and can we make a determination as to that information as a legislative body?
But you can still ask for bill drafts.
I would remind the committee, we have a topic called Title 25 we haven't gotten to. It's 5 o'clock and tomorrow will be very fast. And you'll have an opportunity to vote on probably 7 to 10 bill drafts tomorrow. So get ready.
All right. Anything else, committee?
No, it's so tempting.
It's very tempting to continue. No, okay. All right. We can go to Title 25 if that will appease Co-Chairman Nethercutt. You know, this was a topic that I think was started under the previous, I think we even had a bill. If we had just passed that bill, we wouldn't have this problem. All right. Overview of the 2021 bill draft. Look at that.
Yep.
Mr. Fuller.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be brisk in this overview.
Because it's the previous bill.
Correct, Mr. Chairman. And if you wish, I can give just a brief overview of the Title 25 process. I know Ms. Reed from the Trona County Attorney's Office also provided that, and I'm happy to defer that to her. However you'd like to proceed, I can quickly go over the bill draft that this committee of the last legislature sponsored concerning Title 25, however you'd like to proceed.
Yeah, why don't you just give us an overview of the bill draft?
Okay. So Mr. Chairman, the committee's work last interim was initially focused, or at least the topic that was kind of noted as an interim topic was focused mostly on clarifying what entity pays for certain portions of care for individuals going through the Title 25 process. Current law provides that the county in which a person is detained or in which involuntary hospitalization proceedings are brought must pay the cost of the first 72 hours of detention. And that includes any weekend or holiday, including costs of medical treatment for any conditions that resulted in the emergency detention or that are attributable to affirmative actions taken by the person that have placed the person in danger. The county also is required to pay for proceedings for detention or involuntary hospitalization, clothing, and then costs upon discharge for suitable clothing and adequate means to ensure that person's arrival at the home from which he was admitted or another place upon discharge. When a person is not a Wyoming resident, the Department of Health is required to pay the costs except for those discharge costs. The county would pay for the first 72 hours, even when a hearing on detention is waived. And then all costs of treatment, transportation, and continued detention after the first 72 hours, in addition to any weekend or holiday, is required to be paid by the Department of Health. And then there's a requirement that the state hospital or treatment provider must attempt to recover all costs of treatment from insurance and benefit programs. With that in mind, Mr. Chairman, 2021 Senate File 31 did a number of other things as well. It changes references in Chapter 10 from emergency detention to emergency custody and defines that term for purposes of that process. It renames gatekeepers as treatment coordinators and provides that gatekeepers and treatment coordinators can appear at hearings, provide recommendations regarding treatment and custody, monitor proceedings, and assist to achieve effective treatment for the person who's detained or hospitalized. It requires that emergency custody and treatment must be implemented to create a continuum of care process. It also would have imposed rulemaking requirements on the Department of Health to promulgate rules for the transportation of patients to and from treatment facilities or emergency custody. It clarified that an initial hearing for emergency custody, which is required to be held not later than 72 hours after a person is first placed into emergency detention. It clarifies that it must be held not later than 72 hours after 8 a.m. on the next business day if the person is placed in emergency detention on a weekend or holiday. When a minor is placed in emergency custody, the treatment center where the minor is sent or placed must attempt to notify the parents about that placement and the location. And if they cannot reach the parents, that provider is required to report it to DFS. And then finally, the treatment coordinator or gatekeeper under current parlance would have been required to provide a written report to the county attorney for any person committed to directed outpatient treatment at least once every 6 months. And then, Mr. Chairman, finally, two changes, two kind of provisions in the bill that were not in the introduced version, but were considered by the committee that were deleted out at the final meeting. The first is that the Department of Health or another entity that's authorized to transport patients could not have been held liable for any injury or damages to any patient who is transported by reasonable means. And then the second provision in the bill draft that was deleted out before introduction is that the Department of Health would have been required to reimburse a county for all costs that a county incurs that exceeded 25% of all costs incurred by all counties under the chapter. A measure that was meant to perhaps for counties where proceedings are more often initiated or where more individuals originate from. That was an effort, I believe, to try to equalize, and shift the burden away from, say, 1 or 2 or 3 counties that shoulder that. Mr. Chairman, that's the bill draft in a nutshell, and happy to answer any questions.
Committee. Co-Chairman Nethercutt.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Some additional information. This was a topic from last year's Joint Judiciary Committee. There was a working group on this particular issue. Some of the legislators involved on that working group either did not come back as a result of resigning their positions with the legislature or lost their elections. And so we lost the working group. And as you know, obviously, as a result, we have an entirely new committee. The working group was still working on it before our last meeting. And from our last meeting, it didn't come to consensus. And so even though the committee chose to sponsor the bill, so you'll see the bill was numbered last year, but I chose not to bring it out as a result of it truly not being in its final version and final form. So hoping to continue that working group now. Mr. Boley, who is here, was a member of that working group and can probably provide the greatest number or the greatest detail of information regarding the actual work of the working group. If the co-chair would like to invite him forward, probably help expedite us in where we are.
All right, we call that not ready for prime time. Mr. Bowen. On the bill. Not you, Mr. Bowen. Of course you're ready.
Madam Chairman, Mr. Chairman, committee members, I'm Eric Boley, President of the Wyoming Hospital Association. And Madam Chairman, if we could bring Charmaine Reed up also. She was also on the working committee, as was Senator Cost, I believe. Weren't you with us too, Representative Washington? Just one.
Yeah, let's put Senator Cost in the hot seat.
Do we have Ms. Reed? Oh, she's here. Oh, hi.
All right. Welcome.
Thank you. All right, Charmaine Reed. I'm a deputy county attorney for Natrona County, where we do tons of Title 25 cases and have a lot of experience in this area. Just to jump in, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, in 2018, at a Waco meeting, the Wyoming County Attorneys Association got together like we do at every Waco meeting and discussed Title 25 like we do at every Waco meeting and talked about how horrible it is like we do at every Waco meeting. And at that,
Not how horrible the meeting is, how horrible Title 25 is.
Right. And so at that point, there was a subgroup of us that were tired of talking about how horrible it was and wanting to do something to make it not so horrible. And that's when we established a working group, so a subgroup of the County Attorneys Association. And this group has since 2018 been trying to put something together to address the issues that we've identified that are creating some of the problems. And as part of that, we've met with other stakeholders. We've talked to law enforcement, we've talked to treatment providers and try to get input. So it wasn't just our narrow county attorney perspective. We were trying to get information so we could help correct issues from all different disciplines. Last year, we had a working draft, which all we could ever get from the County Attorneys Association was a conceptual, this is a good idea kind of thing. We ran out of time to get the group together to get a formal blessing or even a formal direction with a majority saying, no, let's go this way. So that's the background to that bill. One of the things that a majority of the county attorneys want, the one thing that I think they probably agree on is that they would like a rewrite as opposed to continuing to patch the current statutes. And I guess as much as anything, we'd like direction from this committee. Is it a non-starter? We're willing to keep working, and with your next meeting being in August, we can potentially finalize something and get a vote on it by the County Attorneys Association to bring back to you in August. If you want, it takes an enormous amount of effort to try and put something like that together. And the working group, our little tiny working group, is happy to do it if it'd be considered. I mean, give it a fair shot. And then at that August meeting, take your input and work with it. It's yours to do with what you want. If you want us to help by drafting something, we're happy to do that. If you want us to help by giving a list of suggestions that have been blessed by as much as possible by the County Attorneys Association, we'd like to do that. I know a lot of you are new, and that's why I gave this yellow sheet just kind of running down who does what, just to try and help you out. And I didn't even wear a watch today, but I know it's late. But
It's 4 o'clock.
right. It being 4 o'clock, I'll go through this carefully. But that gives you an idea. One of the things that when I'm looking at statutes and trying to figure things out is I like to look at the big picture, and that's why I just gave you the table of contents of Title 25. And so that's what we have now. One of the issues that creates a problem is everything for Title 25 is lumped into Article 1. And we think that if we separate out some of the areas, that will help clarify the process and what we want. It will also potentially make it easier when you want to amend it, that you don't have to worry about an amendment in Article 7 messing up everything. Hopefully it's more targeted. And so it's supposed to be a user-friendly and kind of living statutory concept. Another one of the big things in our conceptual draft is having somewhat of a, I don't want to say spectrum, I forgot what word I had, and I won't dig for it, but having one definition for mental illness, and then and it doesn't talk about dangerous, it doesn't talk about inability to care, it's just here's mental illness. And then we have the spectrum of issues that can be created by the mental illness, like up high is somebody who's a danger to themselves or others, maybe a step down, unable to care for themselves. And then a lower tier to try and get to the gatekeeper concept that a lot of people wanted. And it's not completely worked out, but what we have now is if somebody fits the definition of mental illness, it's really unlikely that they should be released to be placed on a directed outpatient commitment. there needs to be a lower tier for that option. And other states have done that. There's ways to try and establish that, which our conceptual draft has worked some of that in. I guess with that said, at a rapid speed, I'm happy to answer questions, and I would really appreciate any direction you have on what you would like the Wyoming County Attorneys Association little tiny task force to do.
Co-Chairman Nethercutt.
Yeah, I just want to thank you for all your work and continued efforts on this. And I think it would be wonderful, and we would be very fortunate to have you continue to work on it in that way and come forward with that, whether it be a semi-blessed working draft. I know that you work heavily in this area. And so even just your opinion on this without a full consensus is valuable to us, and I think helpful and something that we could move forward. So we're doing this work, for you and for others in the profession who are working to provide a safe and constitutional process for those that find themselves in this situation of being involuntarily hospitalized. And so the easier we can make it and user-friendly we can make it, that's the goal. And so that's my assessment.
Madam Chairman. Mr.
Yeah,
Chairman,
please.
we kind of headed down this path, and then our working group, we received different direction, and that's why we came up with the draft that was presented earlier. But if you'll remember, only a few of you were there, but if you remember, the reason we brought this topic forward as an interim topic 2 years ago is because there are inconsistencies from one county to another. And even though it currently states certain things in statute, they're not being adhered to. And so that a lot of it comes down to payment, who's responsible for what. And I know we don't want to address all of that, but I do think that there are certain aspects of this that could be addressed as we make clarifications, as we create clear statute.
Representative Oakley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And perhaps this is a question for the chairman, or certainly more experienced. So I'm hearing you say that you've got this framework and you're struggling to basically kind of get it into statute, but you kind of have the concept. Could we connect them with some LSO help, who are the experts in taking the concept and making it the statute?
Well, I think what the volunteer effort is to basically do just that. I mean, I think the association subcommittee is volunteering to scrap and rewrite the entire Title 25. And of course, we would do that in conjunction with our, LSO drafting conventions, and then it sounds like we would come back in August, in September, and then we would have something substantive to look at and discuss. And to Chairman Nethercutt's point, I mean, if you could reach consensus amongst the prosecutors before then, that'd be great. But if not, I don't think that that's the end of the world either. If you came with and what I mean is yeah, it'd be great if you could have consensus, we'd really appreciate it, because then our job is much easier. But if you're to bring something with as much consensus as you can reach, then we at least know we can begin through that testimony on that bill to figure out, I guess, where it lacks and try to find additional common ground. But yeah, I think that would be a huge feat for you to accomplish between now and then, just in drafting alone, getting consensus on everything.
So Mr. Chairman, we did reach out to that association, and we have some parameters, belts and suspenders, side guards, whatever you want to call them. They've given us what they would consider necessary for them to be supportive, and we think that would be built into what we would bring forward to this committee.
All right.
I just love using all those catchphrases. I haven't heard them yet today.
All right. Well, I like it. Any other questions, committee?
We also did provide Mr. Chairman, we did provide you one pager that kind of is the issues that we're trying to address, to kind of give you the quick bullet points that we hope to clarify as we go through this rewrite.
Okay, and these exist with, these exist somewhat with the parameters that you've received then. Okay. Senator Cost and then Senator Cole.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In all fairness, I'll go ahead and step in and say, in listening to many of these meetings that we had during that interim and all, it was very difficult, in my opinion, for them to be able to work with the current Title 25 to get it to where it needed to be. And therefore, their thought of trying to go to rewriting 25 made more sense. I think there can be more clarity and more orderly procedure to it. Having heard all of their arguments, their presentations and all. And so if it's not out of the realm of possibilities, I think it's definitely a much better transition to what they're trying to reach than just trying to correct what we currently have.
Senator Cole.
Thank you, Co-Chairman Olson. Just a general thought, would it be a good idea to bring in the Wyoming County Commissioner Association to at least have them on board? Because I think it's going to be important to have support, but you know, as the financial part of this really impacts the counties in a large way, and also the state, but they're partners, I think, in this also.
Madam Chair, we can reach out to Mr. Ryman, get them involved.
I think, Mr. Co-Chair, if I can, to Senator Kolb's point, I don't think any of these proposed changes are intending to substantially change how that compensation or payment structure works. But as a result of some of these nuanced changes or particular clarification that's ambiguous now that no one can seem to solve, it might force a decision to be made statutorily as a result of providing that clarification, which may create conflict and also de-conflict in the future by eliminating the ambiguity. So we're kind of forcing the issue to a head by providing the statutory clarification. So that will exist, but it'll be the best result because it'll eliminate that ambiguity, but they should and will be at the table, but no intent to substantially change who pays for what.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Chairman, also you should be aware that with the passage of House Bill 38, there's a working group that's been looking at that, and there has been a doubling down on the gatekeeper concept. And you'll be hearing about that because the gatekeeper is pretty integral to Title 25. But you'll probably hear from WAMSAC and some of the others that it's going to place a real heavy burden on them. And so as we go through the definitions, we may not be in alignment with what they're doing in House Bill 38 with the gatekeeper provision. The other thing that we did have the Department of Health involved in our working group, and some of the definitions we want to clarify don't specifically fit the Department of Health's definitions. And I think Stefan Johansson might be online but I think there's ways we can work through this as we've seen that it works in other states. So we would hope that we could continue that relationship with them to come up with clear definitions for what we need.
Right, and Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, the definitions don't match currently. So we're not, I mean, it might be a different not matching, but we've made it work with their two different titles. So it shouldn't be prohibitive.
Mr. Boley, that House bill, how would you say House Bill 38? Is that a health bill? Because what I'm trying to figure out right now is how does anything that we're discussing right now, or does it tie in at all with the Select Committee on Mental Health and Substance Abuse and what they're working on, or does it? Because I thought they were doing some gatekeeper stuff as well.
Mr. Co-Chair, we did hear from the good representative who chairs that select committee, and he visited the Judiciary Committee in the interim. I anticipate when we have something for them to look at now moving forward, we'd invite them to that second meeting. It doesn't look like our work really overlaps. And it was another concern with the work of House Bill 38, which was the Labor Committee as well. Those were all parallel tracks kind of occurring at the same time because Title 25 is such a big elephant. We're all just taking it one bite at a time that's appropriately placed in each committee. So far, we haven't stepped over ourselves or tried to take from the same bite, so.
Right, so to this effort is hitting the pause button and rewriting. So I just want to, maybe we'll just have to touch base with that committee because I don't know if they're meeting between now and then, or if and I'm talking about the select committee, or if, okay, so they're not gonna start writing fixes to existing statute when we're hitting the pause button.
Mr. Co-Chairman, no, the chairman of that committee knows what we're doing.
Okay.
And is apprised of all of it.
All right. I feel good about that.
They've had one meeting, Mr. Chairman, and there's a second one scheduled for June 29th, just
Okay.
from the shareholders to give feedback and ideas on how that should work.
Okay, okay. Representative Provenza, then Representative Washit.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. I am on that select committee for mental health and substance abuse, and we're working that. There are, although we've met as a select committee once, we are having meetings. I'm on 2 subcommittees for partnerships and transitions of that group. So trying to determine how do we partner up between organizations, mental health providers, and how do we also have transitions. So we're meeting every week.
That's a lot.
Yeah, well, I think it's every other week per subcommittee of the select committee, but there's conversation. So I'm happy to keep this committee apprised to what we are working on, at least in those subgroups.
You know, I served on that committee. You think I would know more, but there's such a blur when you serve on hundreds of committees. It becomes a blur. Representative Washit.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of things. Last year, when we were working this bill, there was quite a bit of discussion about transportation costs. And that perhaps there was going to be a need for some appropriation to address that end of it. So we had labor health looking at a piece of this. We were looking at a piece of this. JAC was going to have to look at some of the cost issues. And then there were some questions about reimbursement rates to those hospitals and private hospitals that are involved. And so I think as we put this thing together, we should anticipate that whatever bill we come up with is probably going to have a re-referral into joint appropriations to look at some of the costs associated with these obligations on the part of the state.
Have you ever sent a bill to joint appropriations?
Yeah, they usually take them on their own.
It's not a fun experience. You don't want your bills to go there if you can avoid it.
Mr. Chairman, I don't know if you want any information on what Representative Washit's discussing, but we do have designated hospitals that accept state patients that the state hospital doesn't have room for. And with the recent budget cuts and other things that have taken place, they're being significantly underpaid. They're not even covering their costs to the tune of hundreds of dollars per day. Right now, the state hospital is full and has a waiting list of over 20 people. One of our biggest partners for the state is WBI. I think they have 41 state patients out of their 53 beds, and they're getting underpaid on every single one of those. So that's a big issue, and that's part of what we're talking about here. The other thing is that patients come in from all over the state, and Natrona County seems to be a magnet for many of those. And the transportation to bring them here, and then the transportation to send them home. A lot of times WBI will pay for those. There are provisions within the state to pay for that, but it doesn't even cover the cost again. And a lot of times they show up without personal belongings. They need to have clothing bought and things like that. And those are the things that I think we'd like to find a way to address it as we move forward with this. And there are other designated hospitals. It's just WBI is the biggest player, obviously. And I don't know what the state would do without them, but we have beds in Gillette and other areas where they are those designated hospitals.
And Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, I don't want to get into the minutia, but I am kind of excited about the flexibility of the proposal. And part of it is having rules that are easier to change as necessary to pay for costs like that. And so the cost, who pays for the costs, make it very, very clear, but also make it flexible. So if this committee of the legislature thinks things need to be changed, it's not some massive undertaking. It's relatively easy and still clear and doesn't mess with the rest of it, which is hopefully working fine.
All right, we're excited about this proposal. Super
I got
excited.
the signal.
All right,
All right, thank you.
thank you so much. Is, I'm assuming Stefan's on, he's on Zoom. We have Amy or Andy Somerville, excuse me. Got your email. You weren't able to join us. That's okay. So let's jump over to Stefan, then we'll go to Andy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Co-Chair, members of the committee, Stefan Johansson with the Wyoming Department of Health. I'll be very brief in that the department just stands ready and willing to support whatever working group or subcommittee is established, similar to our participation last year. I certainly admire Ms. Reed and Mr. Boley's optimism on this process. There's a lot of cooks in the Title 25 kitchen, and it's very difficult to come to consensus. To the extent that we can provide information, data, support to that group or to this committee, I'm certainly happy to do that. I did want to mention, Mr. Chairman, that the work of the House Bill 38 implementation, which was Senate Enrolled Act 56, that is going well. As was mentioned before, we have a number of legislators serving on both the steering committee or select committee, as well as various work groups. I think that is intimately tied to the concepts that you all are discussing with Title 25, as the main purpose of that bill that passed this previous session was to prioritize the types of populations that should be served by our community mental health centers, which often act as our Title 25 gatekeepers. The acute psychiatric population that goes through the Title 25 process is a huge priority for the state in a number of different agencies. And I think that work can dovetail nicely with your consideration of changes that could potentially provide clarification in the statutes of Title 25. So to Madam Co-Chair, to your point, I don't think those efforts have overlapped or that folks are stepping on each other's toes. But to the extent that this committee considers changes to Title 25, I would think it would be advisable to combine those efforts potentially at your next meeting, or at least be briefed by the ongoings of the implementation of that mental health reform. And I believe we are due to report out to the Joint Labor Committee on the progress there at their September meeting. So just to give you a sense of the timeline, those working groups on a variety of different mental health topics are working diligently over the summer to establish recommendations to the steering committee as well as to the Department of Health on implementation. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to stand for any questions and just reiterate the department's support for this process and any help that we can provide over this interim, we're happy to do so.
Perfect. I think we will definitely take that information when it comes in September so we can all be working together on the same common goal. Committee, other questions? Any questions? No. Stefan, thank you for stepping into your role as interim director. Really appreciate you providing the continuity for the state and for all the hard work that you do for the Department of Health. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
All right, Ms. Somerville.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Andy Somerville with WAMSAC. And I think my colleagues and Director Johansson have hit what I wanted to touch on, which was the House Enrolled Act 56 work, because I do think it's important that everybody kind of knows what's going on. Just to be very, very brief today, one thing that I just wanted to bring to everybody's attention is there were a couple of definition changes in House Enrolled Act 56 that apply in the Title 25 statute. Those are pretty minor. It was more of aligning language between Title 25 and Title 35. But there is one other piece that I wanted to bring to your attention, and that is in relation to gatekeepers, which of course is very important to Title 25 process. In the Enrolled Act, it now gives a direction that the Board of County Commissioners and the Department of Health will give preference to behavioral health centers. That's one of the new definitions for community mental health centers, to be providing gatekeeper services. The legislation also goes on to say that the department may, and I want to underscore the may, assume cost responsibility for gatekeeping expenses if only when they are provided through a behavioral health center. So in this whole process, as Director Johansson has indicated, there's definitely a lot of discussion. Title 25 has been a highlight in those discussions in terms of the community mental health center's role in diversion, both to the state hospital, and then when the folks come out of the state hospital, how we're providing them services with the goal of them not having to go back to the state hospital again. And so I think we'll have some additional information for this committee, hopefully by the September 1 deadline, but it is a little bit of an ongoing process. And my last comment is that, as always, we stand ready and willing to continue to work with the working group. We do appreciate the efforts made by Mr. Boley and the County Attorneys Association to include the providers in this very important discussion. So with that, I would stand for any questions.
Committee, questions for WAMSAC? All right, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Mr. Beaver. Do we have a Mr.? We exhausted him.
Couldn't wait till 6 for the 2 o'clock.
Okay, that's too bad. Well, our apologies to Mr. Beaver. All right.
And Mr. Chairman, I do believe, not sure if these were handed out, the single sheet of white paper. This is Title 25 statutory issues. I believe that came from him.
Very good. The bullet point? Okay. All right. Well, I'm sure if he has something tremendously important, he can certainly email it to us and we can follow up at a later point. So, all right. General public comment in the virtual world. In the physical world? They're looking. You double check. You guys are double checking. Yeah. Representative Wanser?
And maybe I wasn't totally paying attention. Where did we end up then on Title 25? That we are encouraging the county attorneys to rewrite it after a 5-year process of the legislature to get what we have in place in 3 years. It's not working and we're going to redraft the whole thing, huh? I'm not,
Yes.
okay. I'm excited.
Mr. Chairman.
I said I was excited.
And I thought we were kind of kidding around and I was like, oh, no, they're doing it.
No,
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah.
Just so I'm clear on your and the committee's expectation for the next meeting, is the expectation that there would be a bill draft in LSO form for the committee to consider working with Ms. Reed and the county attorneys?
Yeah, so we'd like, yes, Mr. Fuller, we would like you to get together with Ms. Reed and the association. And so whatever they're putting together, that we have it in our LSO format for us to the greatest extent possible.
Mr. Co-Chairman, Ms. Reed, this is my thought. Ms. Reed, and for Mr. Fuller, Ms. Reed, you've been working this issue for as many years as the legislature has, but in fact, you work in the business itself and understand how it works, and you know exactly where you're headed and what you think should occur. When you have that draft prepared, if you would provide it to Mr. Fuller to then turn into a bill draft form, and the two of you can discuss any issues that you see, that's it. That's it. And so Mr. Fuller just would be receiving information from Ms. Reed, who would have already spoken with the county attorneys, and Mr. Fuller is not required to meet with them or do anything further. It all will come through Ms. Reed.
All right.
Mr. Chairman. If this is an expectation for our next meeting, not to stress our LSL staff out a little too much, on the approach to the next meeting, should we set a deadline for them to hand over stuff to LSO so he has actual time to do it, or we kind of just like let him handle it in a week before the meeting?
Mr. Co-Chairman, Representative, I think Ms. Reed is a responsible county attorney who will get it to him timely.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah,
Mr.
but
Chairman.
I misread too. I think just to that point, it will take some time for Mr. Fuller to obviously put that into format, and then I think for you to be able to review it, go back and forth, et cetera. But I agree, you can probably be respectful of that time. Okay. All right. Okay. Sensing, oh, did we have public comment? We do. Let's take this public comment. Go ahead. You're on deck.
Thank you. Thank you, Co-Chairman, Representative Olson, Co-Chair Senator Nethercott. Thank you. Cheryl Folland, Wyoming Association of Addiction Professionals. We are a little concerned in some of the language that was rewritten, and I will make my statement very brief. We will be happy to provide in writing our concerns and recommendations for amendment to the language specific to substance abuse that was removed and kind of rewritten in the definitions prior to the changes in the last legislative session on mental health and substance abuse treatment. If a person was presenting to an emergency room for emergency detention and it was specifically a substance abuse problem, that person could not be evaluated. So the mental health situation has to be the primary diagnosis or primary issue from our understanding, and what county attorneys across the area have specifically told us. So we would just very much like to be able to submit that information to you and be available to assist any of the stakeholders and groups that are working on refining this process so that it is a lot more user-friendly than it is at the moment.
Thank you. We would very much like to receive your information.
Thank you.
Committee, anything else? All right, I'll close public comment. And I just want to note that we started a half hour late. We had an extra half hour at lunch, but we're only a half hour behind at this point. So I think that was, we ended spectacularly. All right.
Mr. Chairman.
Yo, yes, Mr. Fuller.
If I may, with apologies and regrets. With your indulgence, I'd just like to run through what I heard as kind of what you're looking for.
Mr. Fuller, that's probably a good idea.
From LSO. I heard a lot of things. I want to make sure that I did not mishear or misinterpret something before we kind of take our marching orders.
Okay.
For the juvenile justice topic, there is a request for information on licensing and requirements, specifically, I think, information about licensing or licenses or professions that still have the moral type language or similar kind of broad language, which licenses require criminal background checks. And then I think a trend or changes in the number of applications and denials since 2018, when that general statute was passed in terms of the look back period and the such. For the discussion, a request for data reporting legislation, starting with the CJIS system. For the state council, disconnect between the legislature. So what I heard there perhaps is a bill draft that adds legislative members, and then also including the current purposes in that statute for the committee to look at. I heard a request for diversion, although it's not clear what direction to go with that. There is whether that should be statewide or mandated or defined. So any clarity on that would be helpful.
Sorry, Mr. Fuller. So I guess on that one, what Representative Zwanser was curious about is if there is some type of model act or majority position of states that we could look to. I know CSG reported to us on decentralized systems, is why they use Texas. That would be the opposite of a decentralized system, obviously. So maybe that's what we're looking at, is the opposite of a decentralized system.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
A uniform, that's the word I was looking for, a uniform system, a centralized system.
Yep. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And then I have some other information about the data reporting piece of it. There is a request for information about what other states pay out for foster care or group care, the average number of children per caseworker, you know, depending on how that's broken down per state, you know, whether that's probation, parole, CHENS, you know, DFS. So that's what we would do for Wyoming, and then look at surrounding states. Looking at, you know, whether there could be some sort of quantifiable financial estimate for the recommendations that the state council made in 2020 that were listed. A model act for, or some sort of uniform act, or research on whether there's a way to have a uniform single point of entry in terms of those standards that prosecutors have, is a request I have. And then finally, a request for understanding the process for juvenile entry into the criminal justice system through law enforcement before adjudication, and then the court procedure and any safeguards currently in place for those minors, both I think in terms of law enforcement and during the court process.
Are there any other titles we left out that we wanted you to just completely research and summarize? No? All right, good job, Mr. Fuller. I think that's a pretty good list. Committee, we're adjourned.